Welcome to How to Play Horus Heresy 3rd Edition. In this video, we are going to cover the entirety of the player turn. On the channel, we have been covering the player turn in individual videos. This video is a collation and collection of all those individual videos. As they were recorded at different times, please forgive any differences in the audio quality, and please do enjoy. The start phase is the first phase of a player's turn and is the most straightforward phase in the game. It contains one subphase, the effect subphase. It comes directly before the movement phase. This phase has one function, the correct timing of special rules and effects. If a special rule includes the phrase "at the start of the player turn" or words to that effect, then it will come into effect now in this phase. If I have a special rule that activates at the start of the player turn, then now is when that effect would activate. If you require any dice rolls, measurements or characteristic checks to activate the special rule, then now is also when you would complete them. For example, the Nuncio Vox is a special piece of war gear that allows a unit to try and remove a tactical status at the start of the player's turn. It is activated during the start phase of their turn as the active player. If I wanted to use a Nuncio Vox, I would declare to my opponent that I am using it and roll the required characteristic check at this point. If you have a special rule or effect that ends at the start of the player turn, then now is the point where that special rule would end. If you require any dice rolls, measurements or characteristic checks to activate that special rule, then now is when you would complete it. For example, the Cybertheurgic right Deactivate Limiters is invoked during a player's turn to buff another friendly unit belonging to the Ordo Reductor. Its beneficial effects last until the controlling player's next start phase. So in this phase, the benefits of Deactivate Limiters would be removed. This also comes with Cybertheurgic Feedback, which has a dangerous consequence of using certain rights. This would also happen in this phase. Note that although you may complete all these various rules and effects in any order, for example removing statuses on squads with the Nuncio Vox, essentially everything in this phase happens at the same time. Essentially, any special rule that mentions the start phase will happen now. It is important that you know and understand the timings of your force's special rules to make your turn run smoothly. Once the start phase is completed, the active player would then move on to the movement phase. The reserve subphase is the first part of the movement phase and comes immediately before the move subphase. This subphase allows you to deploy units onto the table that you've held back from your main deployment at the start of the game. It covers units entering via reserves, deep strike and aerial reserves. Note that when discussing reserves, the use of the word reserves only refers to units entering play via reserves or deep strike. It does not cover units that are part of aerial reserves. Any rule that affects aerial reserves will use that terminology specifically. For example, a command Vox relay is used specifically to make reserves tests easier and more consistent, not aerial reserves. This was clarified via an FAQ available via Warcom. This video will only cover regular reserves and will cover aerial reserves and flyers in general in a separate video. Some missions will allow the player to use reserves. This means that the player can select units from their army and put them in reserve. When a unit is in reserve, it is not deployed with the rest of the army at the start of the game and instead will enter play after the game has started. This is great for protecting key units, adding power to a part of the table that is lacking after seeing your opponent's deployment, getting the drop on enemies in later turns, and also getting key units into positions via deep strike. It does come with some risks though, as a test is needed to bring the unit onto the table and cannot always be guaranteed to happen when you want it. Any unit can be put into reserve. To do this, select your unit or units that you want to be in reserve and place them to one side, not on the table. Transport vehicles can be put into reserve also and can have units embarked within them. Although the unit inside is also technically in reserve, when testing you will do so against the actual transport vehicle. Some units, like drop pods, must start the game in reserves. If this is the case, then the unit's profile will state so. When this subphase happens in your turn, you will do the following. First, you will perform a reserves test for every unit you hold in reserves. Every unit must be tested before any units can be put onto the table. You can do this from your first turn, except for units that enter via Deep Strike, which must be tested from turn 2 onwards. To perform a reserves test, roll a d6 for the unit. On a roll of 3 or more, the test is passed and the unit is eligible to enter play from reserves. If it is a 1 or a 2, then the test is failed and the unit will remain in reserve until the next turn, when you will test for it again. Once all units in reserves have had a reserves test, all the successful units can be placed onto the table. Note that just because a unit has passed its reserves test does not mean you must put it on the table. You can choose to leave it in reserve until a later turn in order to not bring your units in piecemeal. The unit will have to pass another reserve test, however, in the following turn. To bring a unit on from reserve, the player will choose a point on the edge of the table that is within their own deployment zone. This can be the long or short edges and can be at the very edge of the deployment zone also. Most units cannot enter play outside the deployment zone, but if they can, this will be highlighted in their special rules. First, a model from the unit is placed at this point. The player then moves that unit in line with all the rules covered in the move subphase. Models can rush out of reserves, and anti-grav can fly over terrain. Note that a model or unit coming out of reserves always counts as moving, so do not feel the need to keep your model in place to try and benefit from the stationary rule. As with normal movement, you must end the model's movement at least 1 inch away from an enemy model or a friendly model locked in combat. Terrain also affects the movement. Once the model is placed, the player will then do the same with all subsequent models in that unit, until the entire unit is in place and maintains coherency. If coherency cannot be maintained, then any offending models are immediately removed as casualties. After that, the player will then move on to the next unit they want to bring out of reserves. Also note that as this is the reserve subphase, reactions that are part of the move subphase cannot be used against this movement. Units embarked in transport vehicles remain within the vehicle at this point and don't need to do any further movement in the reserve subphase. Models that enter play from reserves count as moving and cannot make any further moves in the following move subphase. However, they can shoot and assault as normal, providing they did not rush. Some units have the outflank special rule. This means that they can enter play from any battlefield edge that is not in the enemy's deployment zone, or within 7 inches of an enemy model. If they do so, they cannot assault in that same turn. If they are a transport vehicle, then the unit within also cannot assault, but can disembark and shoot normally. This is excellent for setting up ambushes or reinforcing weak points in your army. Finally, some units can deploy reserves via Deep Strike. This represents a unit falling onto the battlefield from orbit, leaping from a passing flyer, or even teleporting onto the field using ancient advanced technology. A unit must have the Deep Strike rule, and if they do deploy from Deep Strike, then they can only do so from turn 2 onwards. Only one unit can attempt to Deep Strike per turn, but can occur alongside regular reserves. If the Deep Strike reserve test is failed, it still counts as an attempt. To test for Deep Strike, roll a d6. On a roll of 3 or more, the test is passed and the unit is eligible to enter play from reserves. If it is a 1 or a 2, then the test is failed and the unit will remain in reserve until the next turn, when they will have to test again. To deploy via Deep Strike, place a model from the unit anywhere on the battlefield. This must be at least 1 inch away from enemy models, any battlefield edge, or any impassable terrain. Once this first model is placed, then all subsequent models in the unit should be placed in unit coherency with the first model, but no more than 6 inches away from it. If for any reason coherency cannot be maintained, or a model falls out with the 6 inches, then the offending models are immediately removed as casualties. Deep striking models cannot move in the subsequent move phase, and they cannot charge or assault. However, are free to act normally in the shooting phase. Remember, the unit counts as moving as it has entered play from reserves. Some deep striking units such as drop pods are also transport vehicles. Units within can exit the vehicle normally in the subsequent move subphase and make shooting attacks normally, but cannot assault or charge. Although movement reactions cannot be triggered in this subphase, enemy units can choose to use the intercept reaction. This reaction allows the enemy to shoot at the unit entering play, normally using snapshots. Multiple enemy units can intercept the same unit. Enemies must have line of sight on the model entering play. Be mindful of where you choose to bring your reserves in from. Currently, the rules seem to suggest that a unit can remain in reserves indefinitely if you fail a reserve test every turn. Hopefully this will get FAQ'd in the future. If you guys know if this isn't correct, please let me know where in the rulebook I can find this. In this subphase, the active player moves their units across the battlefield. This subphase is part of the wider movement phase and follows the reserve subphase and comes before the Rout Sub Phase. In this subphase, the active player can move their eligible units into key locations on the battlefield. To move a unit, a player will use the unit's movement value, which is represented by the M value on the unit's profile. This value is the number of inches the unit can move across the table. To move a model, measure the distance from the front of the model's base and move the model so that point is the required number of inches in the desired direction, up to but not over the movement value. When moving a unit, ensure that all the models within it remain within coherency of each other. If they cannot, then they immediately gain the suppress status. You should always finish moving a unit completely before you move on to any other units. The order you can move your units in is entirely up to you. If a unit moves through cover, either difficult or dangerous, then subtract 2 inches from the unit's movement value. You cannot move your unit through impassable terrain. Anti-grav units can ignore terrain when moving, flying over and past it easily. They do not suffer any penalties for passing through dangerous terrain and can even pass over impassable terrain. However, they cannot begin or end their movement in impassable terrain, and if they begin or end their movement in dangerous terrain, then they must take a dangerous terrain test. Units can also rush, which sees the unit move faster to the detriment of shooting or assaulting. To rush, add the unit's initiative characteristic to their movement. A unit that has rushed normally cannot shoot or assault afterward, so be mindful of the units you choose to rush. The rush distance is also impacted by terrain. Vehicles cannot normally rush due to lacking an initiative characteristic. However, a vehicle that has the rapid subtype can add a further 6 inches to its movements for the purpose of rushing. If a rapid vehicle does choose to rush, then it cannot disembark any models it is carrying, and all of its shooting attacks will be made as snapshots. Infantry with the light subtype can add a further 2 to their initiative when they rush, making them incredibly manoeuvrable. They may also make shooting attacks afterwards, but as snapshots. Units with the heavy subtype can never rush. All movement will normally be in a straight line, but can be broken up into smaller parts so long as the overall movement doesn't go over the unit's movement characteristic. Units can move through friendly models and units, including vehicles. However, friendly models cannot be put on top of one another. Units cannot move through enemy models and units and must always end their movement at least 1 inches away from the enemy unit. Anti-grav units, however, can move over enemy units with no issue, so long as they end their movement at least 1 inch away from the enemy unit. Units also cannot pass through friendly units locked in combat, and should always leave a 1 inch distance between the units when ending movement. If a unit moves or rushes, then it counts as having moved. This will have impact on other special rules such as heavy. If a unit does not move or pivots on the spot, then they count as stationary, again making heavy weapons more effective. Units can also embark or disembark from vehicles in this subphase, which will be covered in a separate video. Note that if a unit's movement finishes within 12 inches of an enemy model, then the enemy may use a reaction to that movement. If the movement ends within 12 inches of multiple enemy units, then multiple enemy units can react to that single unit's movement. Finally, whilst most units will be able to move during the move subphase, there are specific situations in which they cannot. The situations are that a unit has just entered play from reserves in that turn, a unit has the pin status, a unit has the routed status, a unit is locked in combat with enemies, and a unit may not move if any model within it has a movement value of 0. The Rout Sub Phase is the final part of the movement phase, and comes immediately after the move sub phase and right before the shooting phase. This sub phase is where units that are routed and in disarray will fall back to their deployment zone in a bid to escape danger. It's also the phase that may see units in your army flee the battlefield completely. This sub phase is distinct from the move sub phase, and as such, no enemy reactions are possible during it. During your games of Horus Heresy, your troops will come under assault by many terrible, esoteric and downright horrifying forces, and as such can suffer from various tactical statuses that severely impede their ability to fight. The most devastating of these tactical statuses is the routed status. This status represents a unit suffering such a devastating and catastrophic assault that they must fall back from the front line in order to attempt to regroup. When routed, a unit is dramatically less effective than normal. A routed unit suffers from the following rules. All shots the unit makes while routed are snapshots, as their flight leaves little time for aiming or precision. The unit cannot make any reactions if they come under further assault in any phase while routed. They are too focused on retreating. A unit that is routed cannot move in the move sub phase and remains pinned to the spot. A routed unit can never attempt to charge or assault an enemy, and if they themselves are charged, then they count as having an initiative value of 1. At the end of that combat, the unit will automatically fall back as if they had lost the combat, regardless of the outcome of the actual fight itself. Routed units never count as stationary. A routed unit can never control or contest an objective. And finally, a routed unit must always fall back in the rout sub phase. Note that a routed unit can have no other tactical statuses applied to it, and if it had another tactical status applied to it prior to becoming routed, then this is immediately removed. This is all incredibly debilitating, and a single unit becoming routed can devastate a well-laid plan of action. Units can become routed from several different sources. A unit becomes routed if it fails a panic test. Panic tests are usually inflicted by flame weapons, phosphex and particularly terrifying opponents. Watch out for Death Guard, Dark Angels, Salamanders and Demons. A unit becomes routed if it loses 25% of its models in a single shooting attack. Note, this 25% is to a singular shooting attack made by another unit, not shooting attacks made by several enemy units. And finally, if a unit is defeated in close combat and fails a leadership test in the resolution subphase, then it is immediately routed and must flee from the enemy. Some units in the game may have other methods of inflicting the routed status, and if so, these will be covered in their special rules. Routing a unit is an incredibly powerful tool in your arsenal, and you should try and be prepared for your opponent to use similar against you. If at the start of the rout sub phase you have any units on the table that have the routed status, then they must immediately fall back. This includes units who have just fallen back from combat in the previous turn, meaning that a unit falls back twice over a very short span of time. When falling back, the controlling player does not decide how and where the unit moves, instead they must use the following steps. For each routed unit, the controlling player must roll a d6. This score is added to the initiative characteristic of the models within the unit. This total is the distance the models must move in inches. Note, different models with different initiative scores will move different distances. The models in the unit will immediately move this distance to the closest point on their deployment zone's board edge. This point may be on the farthest board edge, the short board edge, or can even be a corner of a deployment zone. If a mission does not use deployment zones, then the models instead fall back to the nearest point on any board edge. For example, this squad of tactical marines is routed. In the rout sub phase, their controlling player rolls a d6 and adds it to their initiative. The player scores 5, which is added to the initiative of 4, which totals 9. This tactical squad will fall back 9 inches toward the nearest point of the board edge in their deployment zone. If a model moves through terrain, then the normal 2-inch penalty is applied to that movement. As they must move directly towards the closest point on their board edge, sometimes units can move through dangerous terrain and must take dangerous terrain tests as normal. If the models in a unit encounter an obstacle, such as impassable terrain, then they must move around it and towards the nearest point on the board edge by the quickest means possible. Models cannot end their movement within 1 inch of an enemy model, and must always be placed so they remain 1 inch away but as close to the target board edge as possible. If for any reason they cannot do so, then the model ends its movement early at the first point it would have reached 1 inch from that enemy. The unit must try and maintain coherency as normal. However, every model must move the full fallback distance if possible. This means that a unit can fall out of coherency temporarily. If this occurs, then the unit does not gain the suppressed status as it normally would, and instead simply continues to fall back until it either hits the board edge or removes its routed status. If it removes the status, then the unit must attempt to come back into coherency in the following move subphase. If it cannot, then it would gain the suppressed status. If at any point in the Rout Sub Phase, a model from a routing unit comes into contact with the targeted point on their board edge, then the model immediately stops there. Once the rest of the unit has completed their movement, then the unit has one last chance to re-enter play or risk fleeing from the battlefield. The player immediately takes a leadership test on the unit, rolling 2d6 and attempting to score equal to or under the unit's highest leadership value. If the test is passed, then job's a good one. The unit immediately loses the routed tactical status and instead now gains the suppressed tactical status. This means that while the unit is back under the player's control, they can now only fire snapshots until they can remove the new tactical status. If the test is failed, however, then the unit flees and is immediately removed from the table. For all intents and purposes, the unit has been wiped out and counts as casualties. Becoming routed can seriously impact your game, however there are several steps you can take to try and mitigate its effects. You can have a character with high leadership, such as a Praetor, an Archmagi or a Legate Marshal, join a unit, allowing the unit to use the character's leadership value to try and avoid routed more effectively. If a unit has the routed status, then equipping them with a Nuncio Fox can also help to try and remove that status. Certain traitor units such as demons or true believer units can gain the special role Malefic, which essentially makes them immune to all tactical statuses, meaning they will never flee, but will instead lose wounds instead of taking statuses. Mechanicum armies have access to a wide variety of automata units which are effectively immune to all statuses. However, because of this, they cannot score normally. In order to score normally, they would need a character such as a Tech Priest or a Magos to join them. However, do be warned, the Magos and Tech Priest can be statused and would impart the status effect onto the unit that it has joined. The shooting phase is the third main phase of a player's turn, and immediately follows the movement phase and comes directly before the assault phase. In this phase, your warriors and vehicles will shoot at the enemy with their ranged weapons, usually to destroy them, but also to inflict various statuses on them depending on the weapon being used. Let's break it down step by step. I've broken down each step into individual chapters below so you can get to them quickly. Anytime your unit is making a shooting attack, either as part of the shooting phase, as a reaction, or as volley fire, you will follow the same process. Only eligible units are able to make shooting attacks. An ineligible unit will be one that has either rushed in the movement phase, is locked up in combat, or is embarked upon another model. 1. Select target unit. First, you need to select which unit you want to shoot and who you want them to shoot at. Only units with ranged weapons or powers can make shooting attacks. 2. Check target. Next, you need to check if your unit is able to make a shooting attack against the enemy unit. At least one model from your unit must have line of sight on the enemy unit you want to attack. Line of sight is achieved if a model can draw an unbroken line between it and the target. If a piece of terrain, a vehicle, or some other obstruction impedes this line, then there is no line of sight. If the line is unobstructed, then there is line of sight. Area terrain works slightly differently. Light area terrain never blocks line of sight. Medium area terrain blocks line of sight if the line passes through more than 3 inches of the terrain before reaching the target, and heavy area terrain always blocks line of sight. To have line of sight, a model only needs to see one model in the enemy unit to be considered as having line of sight. It does not necessarily have line of sight of any other models in the unit, but has line of sight on the unit itself. Only models with line of sight can make a shooting attack. If you are drawing line of sight to a vehicle, then you should also determine what facing of the vehicle you will be shooting. Draw your line from your model to the vehicle, and whichever armour facing it touches, that will be the facing that you shoot. If a model can see two facings at the same time, then the enemy player will decide what facing that model will shoot. If a model has line of sight, then it can make a shooting attack against the target. If not, then the player can choose a new target for that unit to shoot, or move on to a different unit to start the process again. Note that you can fire with part of a unit. You don't need to have every model make a shooting attack. 3. Declare weapons. Next, you will declare what weapons you will be using to shoot the enemy unit with. Each model in the unit can normally make a single shooting attack with one weapon. Some specific units may have the firing protocol special rule, which means they can make multiple attacks with multiple weapons, or have weapons such as pistols which allow multiple weapons to be fired. Vehicles and dreadnoughts can always shoot with all of their weapons, so long as they have both line of sight and are in range. If a weapon has more than one profile, for example a plasma gun, then at this point you should also choose which profile you wish to use. You must make your opponent aware of which models are using which profiles prior to shooting. Weapons being fired with a different profile are considered different weapons when forming a firing group. Only weapons that are in range of at least one enemy model and has line of sight may be used as part of your shooting attack. Any models that are not in range or do not have line of sight do not make a shooting attack. An enemy is considered in range if the distance between the two models is equal to or less than the range characteristic of your weapon. If it turns out you are not in range with your weapons, you can return to step 1 and choose a new enemy unit to attack. Note that a unit can only attack one enemy unit at a time. It cannot split fire at multiple units. Vehicles, on the other hand, can split fire, and this should be stated at this point. Each individual weapon should be treated as its own model for the purposes of the shooting attack before moving on to the next. Note that once you've confirmed you will be proceeding on to the next step against the target unit, your opponent can then declare a return fire reaction. 4. Set fire groups. Next, we set fire groups. A fire group is made up of all of the shots made with the same weapon. Weapons that have different names, different profiles, or are fired using a different ballistic skill will form different fire groups. This unit of despoilers is armed with bolt pistols. One of them is armed with a hand flamer, while the sergeant has a combi bolter. This unit would form 3 fire groups. Fire group 1 is all the shots made with the bolt pistols. Fire group 2 is the shots made with the hand flamer, and fire group 3 is the shots made with the combi bolter. 5. Select fire group to resolve. You resolve a fire group by first of all rolling to hit, then wound, then allowing the enemy to make any armour saves they may have against the attack. Groups should be completed one at a time, with all shots in one group being resolved before moving on to another. The order you choose to resolve these, however, is entirely up to you. Although you are resolving fire groups one at a time, all the shots actually happen at the same time in game terms. 6. Make to hit tests. Now we need to see if our troops can actually hit the enemy. We do that by making hit tests for the chosen fire group, which will be familiar to anyone who has played a Games Workshop game before. For that fire group, tally the number of shots this group will make. To do this, we look at the firepower characteristic of the group's weapon, represented by the FP stat. We times the firepower by the number of weapons being fired, and we have our number of shots. A bolter has an FP stat of 2. 10 Marines armed with bolters would have 20 shots. 2 times 10 equals 20. A las cannon has an FP of 1. 10 Marines armed with las cannons have 10 shots. Twin las cannons have an FP of 2. A Land Raider with 3 twin las cannons has 6 shots. 2 times 3 equals 6. Now we have our total shots, we will roll that many dice to make our hit tests. Roll all the dice at once and compare the result to our model's ballistic skill on the ranged hit table on page 194. we are looking to score equal to or higher than the score for that ballistic skill on each dice. A regular tactical marine has a ballistic skill of 4. If we look at the ranged hit test table, we can see that we need 3+ to hit. Any of our dice that show a 3 or higher are hits. Any dice showing 1s or 2s are fails, and these should be discarded. Note that any weapons that have an effect caused by successfully hitting the opponents are now activated. This includes weapons with the stun effect or the suppress effect. 7. Make wound tests. Now we know how many hits have been successful, we now need to see if any of our shots actually inflict damage on the enemy. We do this using a wound test. To do this, we compare the range strength of our weapon, represented by the RS on their profile, against the toughness of our enemy, represented by the T-stat on their profile. We use the table on page 197 to see what score we need to roll. Roll all of the dice that scored a hit again, and compare the scores to the table. We are looking to match or exceed that score for each dice roll. A bolter has a range strength of 4, and shoots a tactical marine whose toughness is also 4. If we look at the table, we see that we need 4+, so any rolls of 4 or more score a wound. Any rolls of 3 or less are fails and should be discarded. A multi-laser has a range strength of 6, and shoots a tech thrall with a toughness of 5. The multi-laser needs a score of 3+ to win the tech thrall. If you are shooting a unit that has different toughness values within it, for example a tech priest with a unit of castellax, then you use the toughness that the majority of the models within the unit have. The 3 castellax have toughness 6, so we would use that toughness value. If there are 2 values that have an equal amount of models in the unit, then use the higher toughness value when shooting. The bulky roll has no impact on the number of models, it is the literal physical models that matters. You do not roll to wound against vehicles and instead must pass an armour penetration test, which we'll cover later in the video. Note that sometimes a hit test or a wound test will trigger a special effect or bonus based on the dice score. For example, a unit with a high ballistic skill might roll high enough to score a critical hit, or a weapon might have the breaching special roll and scores the appropriate amount on their wound test. If this happens, then these become modified dice rolls. All the dice that are modified must be split into their own fire group separate from the main group. The player will finish resolving the current fire group through to completion, and once this is done, they then must resolve the modified fire group next. Note that if all of the dice rolls for either steps are all fails, then the player will automatically move on to their next fire group. Any weapons that have an effect caused by successfully wounding the opponent are now activated. This includes weapons with the panic special roll or the pinning special roll. 8. Select target models. Now we know how many wounds we've caused, we now need to see who has suffered those wounds. The player who controls the unit being shot decides who will suffer the wounds in their unit. Normally, this will encompass the whole unit. So for example, the opposing player would say, I'm going to take these wounds on the tactical marines. If they have a character attached to the unit, like a centurion or a magos, then they can elect to have a fire group wound that character only. However, if they do this, all the shots in that fire group must go onto that character. Note that the models selected do not need to be in line of sight and do not need to be the closest models. It is entirely up to the opposing player who the wounds will go against. 9. Make saving throws. Once the enemy player has chosen the models that were wounded, they now have a chance to see if their armour or shielding stops the wounds and saves the targets. First, we see if the model's armour can actually stop the shot. We compare their saving throw to our weapon's armour penetration characteristic, represented by AP. If the AP is equal to or lower than the armour save number, then it goes clean through their armour and a saving throw is not possible. If the AP is a higher number than their saving throw, then they can try to roll a saving throw. The opposing player rolls 1 dice for every wound caused and tries to score equal to or higher than their model's saving throw. If they do, their armour stops the shot and saves the model. If not, then an unsaved wound is caused and that model suffers immediate damage. The opposing player deducts the damage characteristic of the weapon from their model's wound characteristic. If the wounds characteristic is reduced to 0, then the model is a casualty. If a model has less wounds than they started with but is still above 0, then the next wound must be assigned to them. The opposing player does this for all the shots caused until all have been saved or failed. Note that although we've done all of this for a single model, so long as all the hits caused have the same stats and all the target models have the same stats as well, all the saves can be rolled as a batch. Some models also have invulnerable saves, which are saves that kick in if their armour save is bypassed by AP. Other than this unique quirk, the process for rolling invulnerable saves is the same as rolling regular saves. Models may also have a damage mitigation rule, such as Feel No Pain or Shrouded. This is a special save that kicks in if the model fails their normal save or invulnerable save. The target needed for this specific type of roll will be covered in that model's special rules. 10. Select next fire group. If, after all the saving throws and damage mitigation rolls have been completed for that fire group and enemy models remain, then the shooting player moves on to the next fire group and repeats all the steps from step 6 onward for this new fire group. 11. Remove casualties. This process continues until all the fire groups for the attacking unit have been completed. After that, all the slain models are removed from the table completely. If at any point an enemy unit is fully removed as casualties and fire groups are remaining, then these fire groups cannot be completed and are discarded, and the enemy unit is immediately removed from the table. I have a 10-man tactical squad led by a sergeant armed with a combi melta who have moved this turn. I see a 10-man enemy despoiler squad approaching out in the open and decide I want to shoot them. I check my line of sight is clear and not obstructed. I then declare my weapons. My 9 tacticals will use their bolters, and I decide my sergeant will fire the melta gun part of his combi weapon. This will result in 2 fire groups. Fire group 1 will be all of the bolter shots, while fire group 2 will be the single melta shot. I measure the distance between the units to ensure all my shots can reach. I'll need to measure the sergeant specifically as the melta gun is shorter range than the bolters. Thankfully, all the models are in range and have line of sight. I decide to complete the bolter group first. Looking at the bolter's firepower stat, I see it has 2 shots. As my unit has moved, they won't benefit from the Fury of the Legion special rule. I have 9 models armed with bolters, so timing that by 2 shots, we have 18 bolter shots in total. I roll 18 dice and compare this to my model's ballistic skill. For this example, we are going to ignore the Imperial Fist Legion specific rule and just go with the regular ballistic skill. Tactical Marines have ballistic skill 4, meaning I need to score 3+ on each dice to score hits. I score 11 hits and 7 misses, which I should discard. Now I will roll to wound. A bolter has strength 4 and my target is toughness 4, so I will need to roll 4+ on each dice to score a wound. I reroll all the successful hit dice and I score 8 wounds, a good bit of shooting by any metric. My opponent now decides who will take the wounds in his unit, choosing the Marines armed with chainswords and bolt pistols. He's keen to protect his more effective weapons in the unit. A bolter has an armour penetration value of 5. As 5 is higher than 3, a bolter is incapable of auto-penetrating the despoiler's armour. This means that these shots will allow my opponent to have a saving throw. He rolls 8 saves looking for 3+ as his Marines have power armour. Oh dear. He's failed 4 saves, meaning 4 Marines have been wounded. Each bolter has a damage of 1, and the Marines have 1 wound each. I've now completed the first fire group and the enemy is still alive, so I move on to the next fire group, my sergeant's combi melta. I see the melta gun component has 1 shot, so I roll 1 dice and score another 4+, a hit. Next I roll to wound. Melta guns are very powerful with a range strength of 8. I need a 2 or more to wound and I score that easily. Now I see the melta gun has an AP of 2, which as is lower than 3 means it burns clean through my opponent's armour. Melta guns also deal a massive 3 damage per shot, however damage does not spill over to other models. One model will take all 3 damage, another Marine is instantly melted on the spot. I've completed all my firing group, killing 5 in total, an excellent round of shooting. Additionally, the enemy has lost more than 25% of the unit to one source of fire, my tactical squad, and now may rout at the end of the shooting phase. More on that later. Shooting vehicles is a bit different. You follow all the same steps as before up until step 7. You do not roll wound tests on vehicles, but instead you'll make an armour penetration roll for each successful hit you've made. To make an armour penetration test, roll a d6 for each successful hit and add your weapon's range strength to that score. This is the armour penetration of the shot. You compare this dice roll to the vehicle's armour value. If the total value is less than the vehicle's armour value, then the shot bounces off the vehicle's hull and has no effect. These dice should be discarded. If the total value equals the vehicle's armour value, then the shot glances the vehicle, causing a glancing hit. No damage will be done, however you will inflict a status on the vehicle. Roll a d3 and compare the results to the vehicle damage table. The vehicle immediately suffers that status effect. If you score multiple glancing hits, then you roll multiple times on the table. For every duplicate result on the vehicle damage table after the first, the vehicle will suffer 1 damage from its hull points. If the vehicle already has a status and your glancing hit causes that status again, it suffers 1 damage from its hull points. In this way, it's possible for weaker weapons to status down a vehicle with numerous duplicate results. If the total value exceeds the vehicle's armour value, then the shot penetrates the vehicle's armour and your weapon deals its damage value against the vehicle's hull points. If the vehicle's hull points ever reaches 0, then the vehicle is destroyed. Note that if even after adding a full dice roll of 6 to a weapon's strength it cannot equal the vehicle's armour value, then damaging it is impossible. There is nothing to stop you shooting it still, for example with a shock weapon, but some weapons simply have no chance of damaging vehicles. A bolter is never going to bother a Land Raider. Some weapons are designed to crack vehicles and will have special rules making this easier. For example, blast cannons which have the Armour Bane special rule. Pay attention to your weapon choices when you deal with vehicles. A couple of final points to note before we move on to the next subphase. Although you will handle fire groups one at a time, in World all the shots happen at the same time. Your opponent cannot remove close models to try and outrange some of your weapons. If your weapon is in range in step 3, then it is in range for the full attack subphase. If you have line of sight on a single model from a unit, then you can shoot the entire unit. It is not possible for your opponent to remove models to try and block line of sight in later fire groups. If you have line of sight on a model in step 2, then you will be able to shoot the full unit through the remainder of the attack subphase. You will repeat the previous steps for each of your units you wish to shoot at the enemy until all of your eligible units have shot or chosen not to shoot. Once the attack subphase is complete, then you will move on to the morale subphase. During your attack subphase, you will have been able to inflict various status checks on your enemy, and it is in the morale subphase that you'll see if the enemy's unit gains statuses. Normally, this will be because of one of the following situations. You were able to remove 25% of the enemy unit's models in one round of shooting from one of your units. This will prompt a leadership check. The enemy has fallen out of coherency due to losing models. This will prompt a cool check. You were able to successfully hit with either a stun or suppressive weapon. This will prompt a cool check. You were able to successfully wound with a pinning or a panic weapon. This will prompt a cool check for pinning or a leadership check for panic. There may be other status causing weapons or powers, and these will be highlighted in their special rules. If you are able to achieve one of the previous conditions during your attack subphase on a non-vehicle unit, then place a pair of dice next to the unit to remind you and your opponent that a test will be needed. To take a test, your opponent will roll 2d6 and compare the result to either their unit's leadership stat for leadership tests or cool stat for cool checks. If the dice roll is equal to or less than the stat, then the check is passed and no status is caused. If it is over the value of the stat, then the check is failed and the unit immediately gains the appropriate status. Some weapons and effects will cause a negative modifier to this check. For example, a weapon with pinning 2 means that a cool check will need to be taken by the enemy unit, but they will remove 2 from their total cool before taking the check. Higher numbers make the check harder. You can inflict multiple statuses onto one unit, but a status can only ever be inflicted once. If you hit a unit with 2 pinning weapons, the unit will only need to pass 1 pinning check. You, as the active player, can choose which of these checks will need to be taken. For example, if you hit an enemy with a stun 2 and a stun 1 weapon, then you can choose which modifier will be applied. The routed status supersedes all other statuses, so it's always advisable to perform that check first. If the routed status is gained, then all other status checks are discarded. All statuses inflicted are applied at the end of this subphase, and so have no bearing during the attack subphase itself. The charge subphase is the first part of the main assault phase. The assault phase is split into 4 subphases, with the charge subphase being the subphase that instigates everything. It follows the shooting phase and comes directly before the challenge subphase. In this subphase, your warriors will hurl themselves forward across the battlefield in a bid to close the distance between themselves and the enemy. While rushing forward, intense firefights can erupt between the 2 warring factions before armoured bodies crash into each other with the force of a runaway train. Some warriors may misjudge the distance and fall short, becoming confused in the scrum, while others might be gunned down before they can even draw their weapons. This subphase is both emphatic and game-changing. During this subphase, valid units can make a charge move. A charge move is a multi-stage move made during the assault phase. Unlike normal movement, you can end a charge move in base-to-base contact with enemy models, ignoring the usual 1-inch spacing rule. When in base-to-base contact with an enemy model, friendly units are in combat. You will make a charge move when you want your warriors to fight another unit in close combat. It is usually not compulsory to make a charge move, although some particularly bloodthirsty units might need to make charge moves if highlighted in their special rules. Only an eligible unit can make a charge move. A unit is ineligible to make a charge move if the unit rushed in the movement phase, the unit is already locked up in combat with another unit, the unit is embarked upon another unit, the unit is either pinned or routed, the unit disembarked from a unit that just entered play by either Deep Strike or the Outflank special rule, and most vehicles cannot make charge moves. Questoris Knights and their contemporaries would be the exception to this. If your unit does not fulfill any of these criteria, then they are eligible to make a charge. There may be other situations which make your unit ineligible to make a charge move, and generally there will be a special rule that describes this situation. To make a charge move, your unit will follow 5 key steps. Declare target, check line of sight and maximum charge range, make setup move, make volley attacks, and make charge move. Let's go through each of these step by step. Step 1. Declare target. Like the shooting phase, you must nominate an enemy unit or model that you want your unit to charge. Each unit can only make a charge move against one other unit. You cannot charge at multiple units. Once declared, this unit becomes the target unit for the rest of the phase. All the following actions will be taken against the target unit, no other. Step 2. Check line of sight and maximum charge range. Similarly to making shooting attacks, we now must make sure that we can see the enemy unit and we can also reach them with our charge. First of all, we check line of sight between both units. At least one model from your unit must have line of sight on at least one enemy model from the target unit. Line of sight is achieved if a model can draw an unbroken line between it and the target. If a piece of terrain, a vehicle, or some other obstruction impedes this line, then there is no line of sight. If the line is unobstructed, then there is line of sight. With vehicles, you simply need line of sight on the hull of the vehicle. The facing in this situation does not matter. If your model has line of sight, then you now need to check the distance between the two units. Measure the distance between the closest model in your unit and the closest model in the target unit. This will be so you can see the shortest possible distance between the two units. This does not need to be the model with line of sight, simply the closest model. If the distance between them is more than 12 inches, then a charge is impossible, and you must either select a new target unit for your charge or move on to a different friendly unit. If the distance is 12 inches or less, then a charge move is possible, and you must move on to step 3. The book is very clear. After you have declared a charge, checked line of sight is good, and have achieved the 12-inch requirement, then a charge must happen. You cannot change your mind at this point. The charge move is essentially locked in. I have 3 units who want to charge 3 enemy units. Unit A has declared a charge move against enemy Unit A. They have a clear line of sight over open terrain, and the distance between the closest models in both units is 9 inches. I must move on to step 3 to continue their charge. Unit B has declared a charge against enemy Unit B. Enemy Unit B is partially within medium cover, which would normally block line of sight if more than 3 inches thick. However, as one enemy model is out with the cover, then my unit has line of sight. The distance between the closest models is 12 inches on the nose. I must now move on to step 3 to continue their charge. Unit C has also declared a charge against enemy Unit C. However, from Unit C's perspective, the enemy unit is fully within medium terrain and I do not have line of sight. I return to the start of the process and Unit C instead declares a charge against enemy Unit A. However, although Unit C has clear line of sight, enemy Unit A is 13 inches away, making the charge impossible. Unit C has no valid targets, so a charge cannot be declared for them. Both Units A and B must both proceed to Step 3 of the charge process. Step 3. Make setup move. Unlike other Games Workshop games where your charge distance is entirely random, in Horus Heresy, part of your charge move is clearly defined, meaning you have much more control over the flow of your assault. This is known as a setup move. This is a fixed distance your model will move once you know a charge is possible. Faster, lighter, or more combat-focused units will have a higher setup move, while heavier or more lumbering models will have a lower setup move. After confirming your unit has line of sight and is within 12 inches of the enemy unit, then they must immediately make a setup move. A model's setup move is calculated by adding its movement characteristic, represented by M, to its initiative characteristic, represented by I, and then comparing this score to the setup move distance table. The higher the score, the farther the model will move as part of its setup move. For example, a normal despoiler has a movement value of 7 and an initiative value of 4. Together, this totals 11. If I look at the table, I can see a score of 11 gives me a move of 3 inches. An Assault Marine, on the other hand, also has an initiative of 4, but a movement value of 12 thanks to its jump pack. This gives me a total of 16, which gives me a move of 5 inches. This means the Assault Marine will always move farther and be more likely to get into combat with its setup move than a Despoiler Marine. Once you know the setup distance your models can make, it's time to make your setup move. Note that different models within the unit can have different setup moves, and so will move different distances at this stage. Starting with the model closest to the target unit, move them in a straight line towards the closest model in the enemy unit. They must move their full setup move, it cannot be done partially. If they move, it must be the full distance. The only time they would stop the move early is if the move brings them into base-to-base contact with a model in the target unit. Setup moves ignore terrain modifiers, as your warriors barge through whatever is between them and the enemy. However, if leaving or entering dangerous terrain, then dangerous terrain tests must be taken as normal. If during the dangerous terrain test the moving model is killed, then the player moves on to the next closest model in the unit. You cannot move through terrain features or impassable terrain, and must circumvent them by the quickest route possible. Crucially though, the setup move can 100% end with a model being in base-to-base contact with an enemy model. However, this model can only be part of the target unit.
After the first model has finished its setup move, then the player moves the next closest model at setup move distance and so on, until all models in the unit have completed a setup move. Unit coherency must be maintained, and if it cannot, then a model must end its setup move as close to a friendly model in the same unit as possible. If, after all the setup moves have been completed, any of your models are in base-to-base contact with an enemy model from the target unit, then the charge has been a success. The next steps in the charge process can be skipped, and that unit will immediately move on to the challenge subphase. If the unit has been unable to get into base-to-base contact with an enemy model from the target unit after the setup move, then that unit must immediately move on to step 4. Note that you can elect for your unit not to make a setup move at all. If this is the case, this entire step can be skipped for that unit and they would immediately move on to step 4. This choice is binary. Either the unit moves its full setup move distance or it does not move at all. Step 4. Make volley attacks. The battlefields of the Horus Heresy are frenetic and chaotic, and frequently warriors would need to react in the blink of an eye to enemy assaults. As the enemy charges, firefights between the two parties would break out with shells and energy blasts flying between them, blowing apart the assaulters who are driven forward by sheer bloody momentum. This is represented by volley attacks. And this is legitimately one of my favourite changes 3rd edition has made to Horus Heresy. If at the end of step 3 of the charge process you are not in base-to-base contact with the enemy unit, then a brief firefight will break out between your unit and the target unit. This can make charges especially risky if charging towards enemies with brutal close-range weapons. Units that make setup moves but do not reach the enemy unit now make volley attacks. The target unit then makes volley attacks against the charging unit in return. They are not compulsory, however, and units can elect not to make volley attacks. Volley attacks can only be made between the charging unit and the target unit. No other units may be targeted. To make a volley attack, your unit must have an appropriate weapon to make the volley attack with. Only weapons with the assault trait can make volley attacks. Generally, this trait is found on small arms such as pistols or shotguns, or particularly nimble firearms. An example of a valid volley attack weapon would be the humble bolt pistol. It has the assault trait, meaning that when used as part of a volley attack, it fires once at strength 4 with an armor penetration of 5 and a damage of 1. An assault grenade launcher has 2 profiles, one for crack grenades and one for toxin grenades. Both have the assault trait, and I would need to choose which profile I wish to use before making my volley attack. A hand flamer is also an assault weapon. During a volley attack, it would fire one shot at strength 3 and damage 1. It would use the template rules described in the shooting phase video found here. Once I know I can make a volley attack, I follow all the normal rules for making a shooting attack against the target unit, with the only exception being that all these shots must be made as snapshots. As your warriors are storming forward incredibly aggressively or responding to the charge, there is little time for accuracy or finesse. Also note that no statuses can be inflicted by volley fire. Any special rules which inflict them are ignored at this stage, including against vehicles. Vehicles cannot be glanced at this stage, as statuses can never be inflicted by volley fire. If you are being charged by an enemy unit, then you can also make a volley attack. The enemy unit would complete their shooting attack first, and then you afterwards. It is also at this stage that you could declare an overwatch reaction. Your overwatch reaction will happen after the charging unit has made its volley attack. The overwatch reaction allows you to replace your volley attack with a normal shooting attack at full ballistic skill. This means that instead of snap shooting only with your assault weapons, your unit draws up an ordered firing line and fires any weapons they have at the enemy using normal ballistic skill. This reaction uses 1 point of your reaction allowance. If your unit is already locked up in combat with another unit, then it cannot make a volley attack. Note, however, that the enemy unit can also not make a volley attack against you, as they would also risk hitting their own troops. Vehicles can also make volley attacks. If being charged by an enemy, and they fail to get into base-to-hull contact with your vehicle, then the vehicle can make volley attacks. Again, this must be made with weapons with the assault trait, and are also made as snapshots. These shots must be made with the appropriate firing arc and be in range also. A key part of this is that all pintle-mounted weapons always count as assault weapons, and they have a full 365-degree firing arc. Pintle-mounted weapons are designed specifically to ward off assaults by enemies. A vehicle can also perform the Overwatch reaction. If it does so, then it can fire on the charging unit with all of its defensive weapons, but not its battle weapons. A defensive weapon is any weapons of strength 6 or below, all pintle-mounted weapons, and all sponson weapons. These attacks would be made at full ballistic skill. Some upgrades or special rules may overrule this, allowing battle weapons to be used also. In any case, after both sides have completed their volley attacks and casualties removed, the active player should move on to step 5. If at any point one of the units, either the charging or target unit, is entirely removed as casualties during the volley attack, then the process stops completely at this stage. The attacking player would then move on to their next charging unit. I have 2 units of despoilers. I can see 2 enemy tactical squads on an objective, and I want both my units to charge 1 at each. I check my line of sight is clear and measure the distance between the squads. Despoiler Squad A is 8 inches away from Tactical Squad A, while Despoiler Squad B is 3 inches away from Tactical Squad B. As I've declared charges for both units, they have line of sight and are within 12 inches, I now must make setup moves. To make a setup move, I add the unit's movement to their initiative and compare the results to the setup move distance table on page 253. Despoilers have a movement of 7 and an initiative of 4. Together, this makes 11. Looking at the table, I see that gives me a setup move of 3 inches. Starting with the closest model, I move Despoiler Squad A 3 inches straight towards the enemy tactical squad while maintaining unit coherency. I move each model so that they get as close as possible. If I was moving through cover, I'd also ignore any movement penalties that it confers, but I would still need to take dangerous terrain tests if needed. After all the squad has been moved, none of my models are in base-to-base contact with the enemy squad, so now this squad can make volley fire attacks. I check my despoiler's weapons as I need an assault weapon in order to make a volley attack. All 10 of my models are armed with bolt pistols, which are assault weapons. As I have 10 models, I can make 10 bolt pistol shots as my shooting attack. However, as my squad are charging, I must resolve these shots as snapshots. Using my ballistic skill of 4, I can see that I will need 5s to hit the tactical marines. I roll 10 dice and score 4 hits. I then roll to wound and I score 3 wounds. My opponent takes their armour saves as normal and unfortunately loses 2 of their marines. When it comes to removing casualties, my opponent selects the models who were wounded. They cleverly choose the 2 models in their squad closest to me, which will make my eventual charge move a bit more difficult. As I have not killed the enemy tactical squad outright, they can now volley fire back at me. But my opponent declares that they will make an Overwatch reaction with the surviving models instead. This means that they can use their normal weapons to shoot, and at full ballistic skill too. After an intense round of bolter shooting, I lose 4 of my despoilers. I take the casualties from the back of the unit. I want my squad as close as possible for my eventual charge. With both the volley fire and Overwatch completed, Despoiler Squad A would move on to step 4 of the charge process. Both Despoiler Squad A and Tactical Squad A would also ignore any statuses caused by the weapons and would not need to take any morale checks for losing models. Despoiler Squad B, on the other hand, also makes their setup move of 3 inches. At the end of the movement, a model in my unit is in base-to-base contact with an enemy model from the target unit, meaning the charge has been successful. No volley fire will happen now, and the enemy unit cannot overwatch. Despoiler Squad B would skip the rest of the charge subphase and move straight to the challenge subphase. Step 5. Make charge move. The final step of the charge subphase is making the charge move itself, and this is the part where you will see if your charge is successful or whether your squad falls short in the confusion of the assault. After you and your opponent have completed setup moves and completed any volley attacks and Overwatch reactions, roll 2d6 for the charging unit, and discard the dice with the lowest score. If both are equal, then discard either one. The d6 remaining is your charge roll. This is the number of inches your unit will cover for a successful charge. So for example, if I roll 2d6 and score a 2 and a 5, I would discard the 2 and keep the 5. my charge roll is 5 inches. Compare the charge roll to the distance in inches between the closest model in your unit to the closest model in the enemy unit. If the distance is equal to or less than the charge roll, then the charge is a success and a charge move must be made. If the distance is over the charge roll, then the charge roll is a fail and no charge move can be made. Like the setup move, the charge move ignores modifiers from moving through cover, but still cannot move through impassable terrain and still triggers dangerous terrain tests as normal. Unlike the setup move though, the charge move must happen once it's passed. If the charge is successful, then starting with the closest model of your unit, move each model the full charge roll distance. The aim is to get your model into base-to-base contact with the enemy unit by the shortest route possible. Your model should not touch the base of any enemy models outside of the target unit. However, they can do so if doing otherwise would make it impossible to be in base-to-base contact with a model from the target unit. This most commonly happens when charging into an already existing combat. Your unit must also move around impassable terrain or terrain features by the shortest route possible. All your models should follow this process until they are either in base-to-base contact with a model from the target unit or as close to an enemy model as possible while maintaining unit coherency. Not all models need to get into base-to-base contact at this stage, but if they can, then they should. So long as one of your models makes it into base-to-base contact with an enemy model from the target unit, then the charge move is a success, and both units are now locked in combat. This ends the charge subphase for that unit, who can now move on to the challenge subphase. If the distance needed is over the charge roll, then the charge is a fail. No movement should happen, and the unit must immediately take a cool check. If the cool check is passed, then nothing further happens, and the unit cannot take any further actions this turn. If the test is failed, then that unit is immediately stunned. There may be some situations where a unit who has had a charge declared for it must make a disordered charge. This means the charge isn't as effective as a standard charge and is less likely to be successful. If a unit must make a disordered charge, then it does not make a setup move and it cannot make volley attacks. Both these steps would be skipped for the charging unit. The target unit, however, can make volley attacks and overwatch reaction as normal. After the target unit has volley fired or overwatched, the charging unit makes their charge roll and charge as normal. Disordered charges never trigger special rules for successful charges such as the impact rule, and a model may not manifest any psychic blessings or curses if making a disordered charge. It is my assault phase and I have 3 different units I want to make charges. I have an assault squad who wants to charge an enemy tactical squad out in the open. I have a despoiler squad who have just disembarked from a rhino who wants to charge the same tactical squad. Finally, I have a Leviathan Dreadnought who wants to charge an enemy rhino. I will now decide the order with which I will execute my charges. I decide to go with the assault squad first, letting my opponent know this will be my first charge. First of all, I check my line of sight is clear and the closest models for each unit are within 12 inches. The distance between the closest models is 8 inches. As both line of sight and distance are good, I must now make my setup move. I now calculate my setup move. Assault squads can move 12 and have an initiative of 4. This is a total of 16. Checking the setup move distance table, I see this gives them a setup move of 5 inches. Starting with the closest model, I move the assault squad 5 inches towards the enemy tactical squad. I maintain unit coherency and move the full distance. I could have chosen not to do the setup move at this point as well if I wanted. After my setup move, my models are not in base-to-base contact yet, so now both units can volley fire at one another. As my unit is the one charging, I volley fire first. I look at my unit's weapons, looking for the weapons with the assault trait. These weapons can be used during the volley fire. The whole squad is armed with bolt pistols and the sergeant has a hand flamer. All of these are assault weapons. I follow the shooting attack process. My fire groups will be the 9 bolt pistol shots and 1 hand flamer shot. As I am making volley attacks, all of these will be resolved as snapshots. I start with the bolt pistols, successfully getting 3 hits. 2 of these wounds, and my opponent subsequently fails one of his armour saves. Before he removes any casualties, I also resolve the hand flamer shot. Hand flamers are template weapons, which ignore the rules around snap shooting. I place the template and score 8 hits. Out of this, I get 3 more wounds, and my opponent fails 2 more of his saves. In total, I have killed 3 of his squad. He removes 3 models, removing models close to my unit. He can now make a volley attack, minus the 3 models who have died. However, he decides to use an Overwatch reaction instead. This will replace his volley attack. With his remaining 7 marines, he can use his bolters with full ballistic skill thanks to the Overwatch reaction. And as this is a reaction, his squad will count as stationary, and therefore benefit from the extra shot thanks to Fury of the Legion. The target unit fires 21 bolter shots into my assault marines, scoring 10 hits followed by 5 wounds. I fail 2 of my saves and remove 2 casualties. No statuses or morale checks will occur from either of us firing. With all the shots completed, I now make my charge move. The remaining distance between the closest models is now 4 inches due to my opponent removing casualties. So in my charge roll, I'll need one of my dice to be at least a 4. I roll 2d6, scoring a 2 and a 6. I discard the 2 and keep the 6. My unit will move 6 inches with its charge move. Again, starting with the closest model, I move 6 inches in a straight line towards the closest enemy model. I want to get into base-to-base contact, which I do easily. I then move all the other models 6 inches as well in the same fashion. The majority get into base-to-base contact, while some do not, which is absolutely fine at this stage. With at least one model from my unit in base-to-base contact with the enemy unit, the charge is a success, and both units are now locked in combat. I now move on to my despoilers, letting my opponent know my intentions. All charges are done together before any other fighting takes place. I check line of sight and distance once more. Line of sight is clear and the distance is 6 inches. As the line of sight is clear and the distance is 6 inches, I must now carry on with the charge. However, as they have just disembarked from a rhino, the despoiler squad must make a disordered charge. This means they do not get to make a setup move and cannot volley fire. This would normally leave me in a bit of trouble, as enemy units can volley fire in response. However, as the enemy unit is locked in combat, they cannot volley fire or react to my charge at all. I measure the distance between the closest models and see that I need 6 inches to make the charge. Again, I roll 2d6 and score a 2 and a 3. Disaster! I have failed my charge roll. The unit remains in place and now must pass a cool check. I subsequently fail this too, and now my charging unit of despoilers is stunned, becoming confused in the chaos of the assault. I should have planned this a lot better. Although I failed to get into contact with the enemy unit, that still completes the despoiler's charge move. Finally, I move on to my Leviathan Dreadnought. I check line of sight and the distance between my Dreadnought space and the closest part of the vehicle's hull. The distance is 6 inches, meaning I must move on to my setup move. My Leviathan is a heavy subtype, meaning it is incredibly slow and ponderous. Being heavy means that when calculating its setup move, we do not add its initiative value to its movement characteristic, but instead just use the movement value alone. It has a movement of 6, meaning my setup move is a paltry 1 inch. It waddles forward 1 inch, leaving 5 inches between it and the rhino. Now both parties can volley fire. My Dreadnought has the special rule Implacable Advance. This means that a model with this special rule treats all ranged weapons it has as assault weapons, excluding heavy and ordnance weapons. This is great for volley firing. My Leviathan has 2 melta guns in its fists, 2 heavy flamers and a phosphex launcher. All 3 do not have the heavy or the ordnance special rules, so all 3 can be used as volley fire by the Leviathan. I only form 1 fire group however with my 2 melta guns. Neither my heavy flamer nor my phosphex discharger have any chance of scratching the rhino's front armour. However, Implacable Advance does not overrule the snapshots aspect of volley firing, so I'll still need to roll 5s to hit. I hit with one of the melta guns and now would need a 4+ to penetrate the vehicle's armour. Sadly, I roll a 1. The Rhino can now volley fire back at me. Like most units, it can only volley fire with assault weapons, which are quite rare on vehicles. However, it has a pintle mounted weapon, and pintle mounted weapons always count as assault weapons. It has both a pintle mounted multi-melta and a pintle mounted combi bolter, and it can fire with both. Although it is a vehicle, it will still need to snap fire. It fires its combi bolter needing 5s, but misses with all 4 of its shots. It then fires the multi-melta, again needing 5 but scoring a 6. It will now roll to wound, needing a 4+. It does not count as stationary, as this is not a reaction, so does not benefit from the heavy range strength rule. You can check page 2 of the most recent FAQ and errata which clarifies this. It successfully wounds my Dreadnought. I then fail my invulnerable save and the Dreadnought takes a massive 3 damage. Ouch. However, as my Dreadnought has survived and all the volley fires are now complete, I move on to making my charge move. I roll 2d6 hoping one scores at least a 5. I roll a double 6. I can discard either one. I move my Leviathan forward 6 inches and get into base to hull contact. I have successfully charged the Rhino. And now some final points about the charge subphase. Units that have disembarked from another unit in the same turn are only capable of making disordered charges. A unit that disembarks from a vehicle, for example, would not make a setup move or be able to make volley fire, and would only charge a d6 towards the enemy. Assault vehicles such as Land Raiders or Cestus Assault Rams ignore this penalty and allow units to make normal charges. Units that disembark from vehicles that have used the outflank special rule on the same turn to enter play from reserves outside of a friendly deployment zone cannot have a charge declared for them. If the vehicle entered play as normal through reserves in the deployment zone, not using the outflank special rule, then a charge could be declared for them. Statuses can never be inflicted by weapons during this subphase, and units will never panic due to losing models during the charge subphase. A few points on statuses. Stunned and suppressed units can have charges declared for them. They will fight in the subsequent close combat at initiative 1 however. Pinned and routed units can never have charges declared for them. If you are charging a status unit, then that unit will fight at initiative 1 in the subsequent close combat. Units with any tactical status can make volley attacks. Pinned and suppressed units can make overwatch reactions, and routed and stunned units cannot. The overwatch reaction can only be used if the enemy setup move doesn't get the charging unit into base-to-base contact with your unit. If it does, then the overwatch reaction cannot be declared. A unit with the heavy subtype may only use its movement value when checking the setup move table. If a setup move or charge move successfully gets your models into base-to-base contact with an enemy unit, then this will trigger any instances of the impact special rule your models may have. However, the impact special rule does not trigger from a disordered charge. Many parts of this subphase require measuring between the closest models of each unit. This does not mean the closest models with line of sight, but literally the closest models. It is entirely possible that the closest models cannot see each other or realistically reach each other. There is no multi-charging in 3rd edition. The charging unit has one target and one target only. All the rules discussed in this video take place solely between these two units, no other. And finally, if after successfully passing a charge roll and making a charge move, you have no models in base-to-base contact with the target unit, then this is considered a failed charge. After finishing the charge move, the unit must take a cool check, and if this has failed, then the unit is stunned. This most commonly happens due to special rules or reactions which allow an enemy unit to move at this point, impassable terrain stopping the models from reaching the enemy, or if friendly models die due to dangerous terrain. The challenge subphase is the second part of the main assault phase. It comes immediately after the charge subphase and directly before the fight subphase. This subphase is an entirely optional subphase and can be skipped in certain circumstances. We will discuss when this subphase is appropriate and when it can be skipped over during the video. During this subphase, you can declare a challenge using an eligible model against another eligible model. A challenge is a battle that is fought between only those two models. For a model to be eligible to declare a challenge, it must meet the following conditions. Your model must have the command subtype, the champion subtype, or the paragon subtype in order to declare a challenge. The model must be locked in combat with at least one enemy unit that includes another eligible model. The enemy model should meet the same requirements of being either command, champion, or paragon subtypes as well. And finally, your model must not have the routed status. It can have any other status, however, if routed, it cannot declare a challenge. If all these conditions are met, then your model can declare a challenge. Note that there may be another special rule which stops you from declaring a challenge. If this is the case, this will be specifically noted in that special rule. But why would you declare a challenge? There are a few reasons that you would declare a challenge in a combat. Winning a challenge makes you much more likely to win the overall combat. It allows you to remove a troublesome model which might otherwise kill your other models. It allows you to potentially assassinate an enemy model with one of your own skilled warriors. And finally, it has real narrative heft for two heroes of the respective forces to draw steel against one another. At the start of this subphase, the active player will cycle through each of their active combats that include eligible models and do one of the following. They can either choose not to issue a challenge for that combat, or they can issue a challenge in that combat for an eligible model, in which case the combat continues the challenge subphase process. Once the active player has cycled through all of their combats and either declared challenges or chosen not to, they would then move on to the next appropriate steps. For example, I have 3 active combats on the board. Combat A is my Centurion and a squad of Terminators who is locked in combat with an enemy Praetor and a tactical squad. Combat B is between 2 Despoiler squads. The enemy Despoiler squad is led by a Chaplain. Combat C is between 2 tactical squads. My tactical squad includes a Master Sergeant, as does the enemy squad. My Centurion in Combat A is a command model, as is the enemy Praetor. I decide to declare a challenge for this combat. Combat B contains no champions or command models on my side, and 1 command model on the enemy side. No challenges can be declared by me or my enemy. I skip this combat in this subphase. Combat C contains a champion model, my Master Sergeant. The enemy squad also contains a champion model, another Master Sergeant. I choose to declare a challenge in this combat as well. Combat A and Combat C would now follow the challenge procedure in this subphase, with one challenge being seen through to completion before the other. Combat B would skip the rest of this subphase, and we would come back to it in the next subphase. After you have declared a challenge, you would now follow the challenge process. The challenge process follows 5 key steps: declare challenge, face off, focus, strike, glory. We will go through what happens in each of these steps in detail. Every combat you have declared a challenge for will follow these 5 steps. All other combats will pause momentarily until the next subphase. You should see one challenge through to completion before you start another. 1. Declare challenge. As soon as you have declared you want one of your models to challenge another, you have already started the process. For that combat, you would declare which of your models will be fighting in the following challenge. This model is known as the Challenger. If you have multiple models in the same unit who are all eligible, then at this stage you would declare which of these models will be taking part in the challenge. Only one of your models can fight in said challenge. Then, your opponent must decide whether one of their models will accept the challenge. You do not decide which of their models will take part in the challenge, they will. So long as they also have multiple eligible models in the same combat, they can decide who will step up to the plate. If the opposing player selects a model to answer the challenge, that model becomes the challenged. Both models are temporarily removed from the combat and placed in base-to-base combat outside of it. Although the book doesn't necessarily say so, I think it's only appropriate if you place the models in a suitably epic location, such as on top of a burning vehicle, on a broken wall, or some other cinematically pleasing edifice. For all intents and purposes, until the challenge ends, both models are now out of play, unless a special rule within the challenge states otherwise. If your opponent chooses to decline your challenge, however, or some other special rule means they cannot accept, then the two models remain in the combat. You now choose a model in their unit to gain the Disgrace status. This model must have the Command, Paragon, or Champion subtype. The Disgrace status is a temporary status that halves the weapon skill and the leadership of the target model, and sets its initiative characteristic to 1. Furthermore, the unit the model is with counts as having a status, and so it will also have their initiative set to 1. However, their weapon skill and leadership is unaffected. If any special rules only trigger for a unit that has a status, then these would also activate. Malefic units can also be disgraced, despite normally being immune to other statuses. The active player would then move on to the next combat they had declared a challenge for, while this combat pauses temporarily until the next subphase. Importantly, unlike other statuses, the Disgrace status is automatically removed at the end phase of the player turn in which the status was first inflicted. There is no need for any cool or leadership test to remove it. A unit can have the Disgrace status alongside other statuses, including the Routed status. They are not mutually exclusive. Now that both models are separated from the combat, it is time to move on to the challenge itself. First of all, both warriors will size each other up and think about how they will approach this battle. Will they go in with frenzied brutality to end the fight quickly, or will they fight more cautiously and tactically, keen to play the long game? This is represented by gambits. Gambits are the special techniques and styles your models will fight with. Think of them as a set of special moves your model can use to help them win the challenge. Each player may choose a gambit at the start of each round of the challenge to help them win, survive, or even escape the challenge altogether. As the person who instigated the challenge, the challenger gets to pick their gambit first. This is known as challenge advantage. This is important because while both players get to pick a gambit, you cannot pick the same gambit. As soon as one player chooses a gambit, it immediately becomes unavailable to the other player for that round of the challenge. Players can also elect not to use a gambit for the challenge at all. Once the player with challenge advantage picks their gambit, they apply any buffs or special effects of that gambit before their opponent chooses theirs. Then, the opposing player would choose their gambit and apply its effects. There are numerous different gambits available to use dependent on your faction and unit. However, for simplicity, we will use the core gambits presented in the Age of Darkness rulebook, which can be found on page 258. Players can choose from one of 9 core gambits in the rulebook. Note that many of these gambits will have terminology or concepts that we've not described just yet, so don't panic if you don't understand them fully. Seize the initiative. Your warrior tenses their muscles, ready to launch forward with a burst of speed to try and hit their enemy before they have a chance to strike back. If this gambit is chosen, then the player will roll 2 dice instead of 1 in the focus step and take the highest one as their dice roll. Picking this gambit gives you a higher chance of potentially hitting your enemy first, and maybe denying them the chance to fight back if you can kill them quickly. Flurry of blows. Your warrior swings their weapons wildly at the opponent, no real precision or focus in their blows. They seek only to drown their opponent in a blizzard of steel, hoping the torrent of strikes will be enough to lay them low. If chosen, the model will add D3 to their attack characteristic for this round. However, all their hits will be damage 1 regardless of any weapons or special rules that say otherwise. This damage can also never be modified by rules such as Shred or critical hits, although other effects of these rules will still apply. This gambit puts all of your character's energy into hitting the opponent with numerous hits. A potential extra 3 attacks can be huge in a challenge, but the damage reduction balances this out. This is an excellent gambit to pick if your opponent is already wounded and you only need 1 or 2 damage to lay them low. Test the foe. Your warrior strikes a defensive stance, seeking to understand their opponent's abilities before committing fully to the battle. Then, and only then, do they commit. If chosen, then the model gains no additional benefits in the focus or strike steps of this round of the challenge. However, if they survive, then they will automatically gain challenge advantage next round. This gambit is all about outlasting your enemy, relying on your skill or endurance to see you through to the next round. Commonly, folk would use this if their opponent had picked the gambit they wanted first. Once challenge advantage is back on your side, then you can choose the gambit you originally wanted. Guard up. Your warrior draws their guard in close, placing their weapons squarely between them and their opponent. They seek only to ward off any attacks coming toward them, in the hopes that the enemy will exhaust themselves or leave themselves open, allowing the warrior to strike back even harder. If chosen, the model gains +1 weapon skill, but now may only make one single attack regardless of their attack characteristic or bonuses. Then, in the actual strike step, every attack that their opponent fails to hit you with will add +1 to their focus roll next round. Again, this gambit is all about outlasting your opponent and can be very useful for slow models or models up against enemies with high attacks but low weapon skill. As you raise your weapon skill, you naturally become harder to hit, meaning that even opponents with superior combat abilities will need to be careful. Taunt and Bait. The warrior is a sadist and sees the battle as nothing more than a game, toying with their opponent for the mirth and adulation of their comrades. The eventual kill will be all the more rewarding for it. If chosen, then the model will reduce its weapon skill and attacks to match those of its opponent. If either of these characteristics were already equal, then these are lowered by -1 instead. If your model's characteristics are already lower, then no change occurs. Every single time this gambit is chosen in the challenge, the player will add +1 to the eventual combat resolution score at the end of the overall combat if they win the challenge. Choosing this gambit 5 times and then winning the challenge will score the player an additional +5 combat resolution points. This is a flamboyant and risky gambit, one no doubt favoured by the warriors of the 3rd Legion and the 8th Legion. It can be chosen to tactically boost your combat resolution at the end of the combat, but does put your model at much higher risk. You should be extremely confident you can win the eventual challenge outright before picking this gambit. Grandstand. The challenge is a performance, and your warrior is the star. They battle only for the adulation of their peers, and are energised by the adoring roars of their comrades as they dance and weave between their opponent's blows. When performing the focus roll, you will roll 2 dice and discard the highest score. Also, you do not gain any benefit from outside support for this round, making you less likely to go first. However, during the actual strike step, you can add your outside support bonus to your attacks instead. This is a showy, flashy gambit, which is great if your character is part of a very large unit, has high base initiative, and you are confident in their abilities. It does come with some major risks during the focus roll, but will pay off when your character gets to attack by boosting the amount of hits they can make. Feint and Riposte. The challenger is a consummate duelist, highly skilled at reading their enemy's movements to deny them any advantage. This is a highly tactical gambit and can only be selected by the model with challenge advantage. The model that uses Feint and Riposte chooses any other gambit in the game, including army and faction specific gambits, and declares that the enemy player cannot use that gambit. The model with challenge advantage gains no additional benefits because of this. When the enemy then chooses their gambit, they are unable to choose the gambit highlighted by their opponent. This is another risky, but potentially very powerful gambit. On the one hand, you do not give your model any bonuses during this round of the challenge. However, you effectively stop your opponent using their most desirable gambit, meaning they need to change up their plan for the battle to come. Withdraw. The model sees the futility in the situation and seeks only to rejoin their warriors, putting all their abilities into fending off the enemy attack long enough to exit the challenge on their terms. When selected, the model may only make one single attack in the strike step, regardless of any other special rules or weapon effects. Then, In the Glory step, the player who chose this gambit can choose to end the challenge then and there. Both models are returned to their units and no combat resolution is scored by either party. This gambit allows your model to potentially escape a challenge early, which is normally very useful if your model is severely wounded or facing a vastly superior opponent. It obviously puts you at a disadvantage having only one single attack, but can have a massive impact on the wider combat. Finishing blow. The warrior puts all their strength into rending their foe apart, discarding all skill and agility in order to simply break their opponent utterly. This gambit is all about raw aggression. When selected, the player will roll 2 dice instead of 1 in the focus step and take the lowest one as their dice roll. However, they will also gain +1 strength and +1 damage to all of their attacks in this round of the challenge. As the name suggests, this is an excellent gambit for killing an opponent utterly. Any gambit that improves your physical combat ability is naturally great, but the hindering of your initial dice roll makes this gambit risky. Note that if at any point the special rules of any two gambits clash and introduce a contradictory or impossible scenario, then the gambit chosen by the player with challenge advantage is the one that takes primacy. My Centurion has challenge advantage against an enemy chaplain. I would really like my Centurion to hit first, as he has a quite slow but powerful thunder hammer. Looking at the standard gambits, I see that Seize the Initiative would improve my chances of going first. I choose this gambit, letting my opponent know. I place 2d6 next to my Centurion in preparation for the next step. Now my opponent can choose a gambit for his chaplain. He knows that he cannot use Seize the Initiative, as I have selected this already. He wants to try and survive the combat so he can strike back. Looking at the list, he sees that Guard Up will improve his weapon skill, making him more difficult to hit. Even though he'll only have one attack, he's confident he can kill my Centurion with it. Plus, any attacks my Centurion misses will add to his focus roll in the next round. He chooses Guard Up. Now that we've both selected our gambits, we can move on to step 3, Focus. Now that our challengers are chosen, and we know how they are both approaching the battle to come, we now need to figure out which of them will attack first. This is called Focus, and is one of the most crucial parts of the whole sub-phase. First of all, both players will decide what weapon they want their model to use in the challenge. The reactive player will choose their weapon first. Only melee weapons can be used in a challenge, and only one melee weapon can be selected by the model. Models that have multiple melee weapons must choose which one they want to use. Once both models have chosen their weapons, both players will roll a d6 for their model. This is the focus roll, and will decide who will attack first in the challenge. Whoever scores the highest in the focus roll will go first. Note that some gambits tell you to roll multiple d6 and choose specific ones for your focus roll, so be sure to do this at this stage. Once the dice have been rolled, we then need to make some modifiers to the final score based on several factors such as our model's initiative, the weapon they're using, the gambit they've chosen, and support provided by other warriors in the same combat. To your focus roll, do the following. Add your model's initiative characteristic. This is represented on your unit profile by the I stat. This characteristic might also be changed based on the weapon you are using. Check the weapon's initiative modifier, represented by IM, on the weapon's profile before adding the bonus to your focus roll. If your model has the heavy subtype, then take 1 away from your focus roll. If your model has the light subtype, then add 1 to your focus roll. For every wound your model has suffered, take a point away from the focus roll. So if my character has suffered 2 wounds, then I'll take 2 away from my focus roll. If my model or its weapon has the Duelist Edge X special rule, then I add the value of X to my focus roll. Finally, I'll get a bonus to my focus roll for other models engaged in the same combat known as outside support. For every 5 friendly models on my side engaged in the same combat, I'll add +1 to my focus roll. If I have 10 warriors engaged alongside my model, I'll add 2. If I have 20, I'll add 4. These models don't need to be part of the same unit, simply engaged in the same combat. Vehicles and automata do not count towards outside support, and models with a pinned, suppressed, stunned or routed status also do not count. Walkers, on the other hand, do count, and actually count as 5 models for the purposes of outside support, so they would give a bonus of +1 by themselves. If the enemy unit only contains the enemy model involved in the challenge, then this bonus is doubled to +2 for every 5 models. This can include models with a status, but only in this scenario. Not all the models need to be engaged with the sole remaining enemy model. The bulky rule has no effect on the number of models, only physical models counts. A swirling melee has broken out in the centre of the table, consisting of 2 of my 10-man despoiler squads and 1 of my dreadnoughts. The enemy side has a 20-man tactical squad and 5 terminators. Within the melee are a pair of centurions locked in a challenge. My side has a total of 21 models engaged in the combat, not including my centurion, one of which is a walker. My centurion's outside support bonus would be +5. 25 divided by 5 is 5. My enemy has a total of 25 models involved in the combat, not including his centurion. His outside support bonus would be +5. 25 divided by 5 is 5. Note that the Terminators do not offer any further bonuses for being bulky models, they would just be counted as their actual model count. Once both players have completed all these modifiers, whoever has the highest final score will be the winner of the focus roll. They will attack first in the strike step, and will get a +1 attack bonus in said step as well. Equally importantly, they will also now have challenge advantage. This will be important later on. If the result of the focus roll is a draw, then both players will simply roll their d6 again until one player wins. Once a winner has been decided, then you would move on to step 4, the strike step. My Centurion is armed with a power axe and is accompanied by 5 Terminators. I roll a d6 for my focus roll and score a 5. Now I add and subtract my modifiers. My Centurion's initiative is 5, so I add that to the roll. I'm now on 10. However, a power axe has an initiative modifier of -1, so I take 1 away. I'm now on 9. My Centurion is wearing Cataphractii Terminator armour, so is a heavy subtype. I take another 1 away, making my score 8. He has suffered no wounds, so I don't need to take anything away. I'm still on 8. I have 5 other models involved in the same combat, which gives me +1 outside support bonus. I'm now on 9. My focus roll is 9. If this is higher than my opponent's final score, then I win the focus roll. I would gain challenge advantage, attack first in the strike step, and also gain a +1 attack bonus for said strike step. If my opponent's focus roll is higher, then they would gain all those benefits instead. Step 4. Strike. We now move on to the strike step. This is where your model will make its attacks and try to kill the enemy model. Both models will follow the same procedure, and it is almost identical to how you normally resolve combat in that you make hit tests, make wound tests, make saves, and apply damage. The key difference is the order in which all of this happens. The player with challenge advantage will go first in this step. They will make all their attacks on the enemy model first in one single strike group. If the opponent survives, then they will make all their attacks in a single strike group back. A. Make hit tests. The model will make a number of hit tests equal to their attack characteristic on their unit profile. The winner of the focus roll will also add 1 to this characteristic, and some weapons like pairs of lightning claws will add further attacks. Note that some gambits will set this number to 1 regardless of any other factors. The player will roll the required number of dice and compare the results to the weapon skill table on page 195 of the core rulebook. They would compare their model's weapon skill against the weapon skill of the enemy model only. So, we can see that if both models have a weapon skill of 5, then I'll need 4s or more on my dice to hit. If I am weapon skill 6 and the enemy is weapon skill 4, then I'll need 3 pluses. All dice that have the required score are hits. Any that do not are misses and should be discarded. Note that rules such as critical hits and rending would also happen at this stage. These modified hits would form a separate strike group. Make wound tests. We would then reroll all of the successful hit dice in order to make wound tests. We do this by comparing the strength of our attacks to the toughness of our target and using the wound table on page 197 of the core rulebook. We are looking to score equal to or higher on these wound tests. Any dice that successfully hit the required score cause a wound. Any that do not are discarded. Saving throws and damage mitigation. The opposing player now has a chance to try and stop these wounds using their saving throws and damage mitigation throws. These work exactly the same as saving throws used in any other subphase. First we see if the model's armour can stop the shot. We compare their saving throw to our weapon's armour penetration or AP. If the AP is equal to or lower than the armour save number, then it goes clean through their armour and a saving throw is not possible. If the AP is a higher number, then they can try to roll a saving throw. Some models also have invulnerable saves, which are saves that kick in if their saving throw is bypassed by armour penetration. Other than this unique quirk, the process for rolling invulnerable saves is the same as regular saving throws. Models may also have a damage mitigation rule, such as Feel No Pain. This is a special save that kicks in if the model fails their saving throw or invulnerable save. The target needed for this specific type of role will be covered in that model's special rule. And this damage mitigation rule is in addition to their normal saving throw or invulnerable save. Apply damage. Each unsaved wound will apply damage to the target's wound characteristic represented by W. If the damage applied reduces the model to 0 wounds, then it is removed as a casualty. If it has wounds remaining after all the damage has been applied, then it now gets to attack back following all the same steps as before. If either one of the models is removed as a casualty at any point in this step, then the remaining model is declared the victor and wins the challenge. In this instance, the surviving model would move on to the next step, the glory step. However, you may end up in a situation where both models survive the other's attacks. What do you do then? In this situation, the challenge is a draw. Now the next steps depend on the player with challenge advantage. The player with challenge advantage can now decide to simply repeat the previous steps again. Face off, focus, and strike. There is no limit to how many times these steps can be repeated, but it is always the player with challenge advantage who decides. This can go round and round until one of the models is dead, or the player with challenge advantage chooses to end the challenge. Alternatively, the player with challenge advantage can choose to move on to the next step, the glory step. Step 5. Glory. The final step in the process is the glory step. This is where we see who is the ultimate victor of the challenge and how this will impact the surrounding combat. If a model successfully kills the enemy model, then they are the winner. They now gain a number of combat resolution points equal to the number of base wounds the enemy model had. So if the enemy model had 5 base wounds, then I would get +5 combat resolution for killing it in the challenge. Note that it is not how many wounds you inflicted in the combat, but how many base wounds the model had, which defines how many points you will get. If the model was a paragon or a command subtype, then you get another point on top of that. If both models survive the challenge, then whoever caused the most wounds is the winner of the challenge. They would get the number of wounds inflicted as combat resolution points for the coming fight subphase. The loser would get nothing. If no wounds were caused during the challenge, or both models caused the same amount of wounds, then the challenge is a draw, and no one gets a bonus to their combat resolution at all. Once glory has been completed, you then move on to the next combat which contains a challenge and play until that is complete as well. If there are no more combats with challenges, then challenge subphase ends and the fight subphase begins. The dueling model or models are kept to one side for now, and are returned to their units during the resolution subphase. When they are returned, they can be placed anywhere, so long as they are in unit coherency of their unit and are still engaged with the enemy unit as well. If their unit has been completely wiped out, then the model should be placed in base-to-base contact with the enemy unit and remain locked in combat. Note that as the models are not placed back into the combat until the resolution subphase, then they cannot be attacked at all by the enemy unit in this turn, and vice versa. If a unit fights in a challenge, it cannot take part in any way in the fight subphase of the same turn, including having wounds allocated to it. Resolution is then calculated, including any bonus points accrued by the challenge. I will also have a video on the fight and resolution subphase separate from this video, and will cover this part of the process in more detail then. Let's talk about a special advanced reaction known as Heroic Intervention. This is an advanced reaction that allows you to declare a challenge on your own terms during the enemy player's turn. You can use this reaction if you fulfill the following. The model using the reaction must have the command subtype, the champion subtype, or the paragon subtype in order to declare this challenge. The model must be locked in combat with at least one enemy unit that includes another eligible model. This enemy model should meet the same requirements of being command, champion, or paragon subtypes as well. Your model must not have the routed status or the stun status. And finally, you have one or more reaction points remaining, and the model or the unit it is with has not used a reaction this turn. If you meet all these points, then you can declare this reaction. The trigger for the reaction is step 1 of the challenge subphase. If the active player has a situation where they could declare a challenge but choose not to, you can immediately declare this reaction. Your positions then become reversed, with you acting as the challenger and the enemy player becoming the challenged. What's powerful about this is that if your opponent then declines this challenge, then you can now choose a model in their unit to gain the disgrace status, and the unit it is with is forced to become Initiative 1. This can be very powerful and can easily turn the tables on an enemy unit. If they accept, then you would follow all the previous steps, only with your model starting with challenge advantage. Challenges are a massive part of the game, and a deeply rewarding one which can really change the face of a battle. They can be daunting at first, but once you get into the swing of how they work, they become an excellent tool in your arsenal. If you're not engaging with them, then you're denying yourself access to an extremely powerful weapon.
The fight subphase is the third part of the assault phase. It comes directly after the challenge subphase and directly before the resolution subphase. In this subphase, your warriors will draw steel against their opponents, hacking and slashing and smiting their enemies in the madness and bloodshed of melee combat. They will seek to unmake their enemy with raw strength and bloody fury. This is one of the most impactful subphases in the game, and can see whole units either vanish beneath the blows of their enemies or rout in the face of their impending annihilation. In this subphase, your units will fight in close combat. Only units that start this subphase locked in combat with an enemy unit may take part in this subphase. To be locked in combat, a model in your unit must be in base-to-base contact with at least one model in an enemy unit. This situation normally occurs after a successful charge move by either you or your enemy in a previous turn or subphase. At the start of this subphase, the active player will choose each of the combats active on the table one at a time and in any order that they choose. Once a combat is selected, then the players will complete a combat round for that combat. They will do this for all active combats on the table. There are 4 active combats on this table. Models from both sides are in base-to-base contact with one another. Some from successful charges last turn by my opponent, and some successful charges by me this turn. As it is my turn, I can decide which order we complete these combats in. I decide to go from right to left. For each, my opponent and I would complete a full round of combat before moving on to the next. We would complete a full round of combat for each unit locked in combat, and once that is done, the fight subphase would be complete. A round of combat is made up of 5 steps. Determine combat units, declare weapons and set initiative steps, resolve first initiative step, continue resolving initiative steps, and make final pile-in moves. We will go through each of these steps in detail, with examples along the way to make clear what you should do for each of them. Step 1. Determine combat units. In this step, you will determine who is fighting in each of the combats and who they are fighting against. As mentioned previously, models should be locked in combat to take part in this subphase. If one or more of your models from a unit is in base-to-base contact with one or more models from an enemy unit, then these units are locked in combat. These two units are the combat units and will battle each other in the next steps. If you have a single unit in base-to-base contact with more than one enemy unit, then all of these units are combat units. They will all fight in the same combat. Similarly, if you have multiple of your units in base-to-base contact with a single enemy unit, then all of these units are combat units and will take part in that one combat. All your units can attack that single enemy unit. Units may only make attacks in one combat per assault phase. There are two active combats on this board. Combat A consists of one of my tactical squads and one of the enemy tactical squads. At least one model from my squad is in base-to-base contact with at least one model from the enemy squad. These squads are locked in combat and both will fight in Combat A. Combat B consists of one of my tactical squads and two enemy tactical squads. Both enemy units have models in base-to-base contact with models in my unit, so all three are locked in combat. These three squads will fight in Combat B. This Despoiler squad is in base-to-base contact with no other squads. They are not locked in combat and they do not take part in this subphase. Step 2. Declare weapons and set initiative steps. Now we know who is fighting who, we now need to decide how they are fighting and in what order. This step is all about looking at your model's initiative characteristic, represented by I, to decide when they will perform their attacks in comparison to other models involved in the same combat. Models with a high initiative stat are faster with quicker reflexes and are more likely to strike their enemies first. Models with lower initiative tend to be slower and are more likely to strike afterward. The weapon a model is wielding may also impact their initiative, with heavier, more powerful weapons hampering their ability to strike quickly. In some situations, faster models may even kill slower models before they have a chance to fight back. We decide this by setting initiative steps. First of all, for every model involved in a combat, each player will decide what weapon those models will use in the fight. The reactive player chooses their weapons first. Only melee weapons can be used in a combat, and only one melee weapon can be selected by the models involved. Models that have multiple melee weapons must choose which one they want to use. Different models in your unit can use different weapons from each other, but again, only one weapon can be used in the subphase. All of the model's attacks will be used with that weapon in the combat. For example, if my model has 3 attacks, and I choose a power sword as its weapon, then all 3 of its attacks will be made with the power sword. If a model has no melee weapons, then they will instead use the basic close combat weapon profile. This represents them punching, kicking, biting and bludgeoning their opponent with whatever they have to hand. What weapon you choose can have an impact on your model's initiative characteristic. This is represented by the IM, or initiative modifier stat, on the melee weapon. Some weapons will make your models quicker, while others will make them slower. Once you've picked your weapon for your model, apply the initiative modifier to their initiative to generate their initiative score. Both players should do this for all models involved in the combat. Once you know what the initiative characteristics of all models involved are, then you can set your initiative steps. Each initiative step will include all the models from both sides involved in the combat that have the same score. So, for example, initiative step 4 will include all models that have an initiative of 4. Starting with the models with the highest initiative scores after the initiative modifier has been applied, group them by step to decide who will be attacking and when. I have a 10-man Despoiler squad in combat with my opponent's 10-man tactical squad. My sergeant has a power fist, while 2 of the Despoilers have power mauls. The rest have chainswords. My opponent's squad only has basic close combat weapons. all models involved have a base initiative characteristic of 4. However, the different weapon options will change some of the model's initiative characteristics. A Power Fist has an initiative modifier of -3. Taking this from my Sergeant's initiative of 4 leaves him with 1. Power Mauls have an initiative modifier of -1. Taking this from the Despoiler's initiative of 4 leaves them with 3. Both my remaining Despoilers and the Tacticals have no initiative modifier on their weapons and will remain at initiative 4. So this combat will have 3 initiative steps. Initiative Step 4 will contain all the Initiative 4 models, 7 of my Despoilers and the 10 Tactical Marines. Initiative Step 3 will contain my 2 Despoilers armed with Power Mauls. Initiative Step 1 will contain just my Sergeant with the Power Fist. All models in an initiative step will attack at the same time, and will attack before models in a later initiative step. The higher initiative steps will always occur before the lower ones, and will always happen in that order. An important note about status effects. If you or the enemy unit involved in a combat has a status such as routed, pinned, suppressed, stunned or disgraced, then they will always count as initiative 1. This cannot be modified in any way. Models with a status will always make their attacks in initiative step 1. Now we know who is fighting, what they're hitting each other with, and when they're hitting each other, we can now move on to step 3, resolve first initiative step. All initiative steps will play out using the same steps and pattern regardless of when they happen, so we'll have a look at how to resolve initiative step end to end and then move on from there. Each initiative step is a self-contained stage which allows all models in that step to make attacks with their chosen melee weapons. Only models with an initiative equal to the current initiative step may make attacks in that step. So in initiative step 3, only models with an initiative of 3 may make attacks in that step. You always start with the highest initiative step in the current combat. For all initiative steps, players will follow the same procedure. Declare combatants, make pile-in moves, declare engaged models, set strike groups, make hit tests, make wound tests, select strike group and target model, saving throws and damage mitigation, select next strike group, and remove casualties. You'll recognise some of the terminology from the shooting attack process, and much of this process functions in a very similar way. It is important knowing where the key differences are so this sub-phase runs smoothly. To help us complete this process, we'll return to the Despoilers and Tactical Squad. My Sergeant has a Power Fist, while 2 of my Despoilers have Power Mauls. The rest have Chainswords. My opponent's squad only has basic close combat weapons. Previously, we had sorted the combat into 3 initiative steps. As you start with the highest first, we will start with initiative step 4. Step 1. Declare combatants. The first thing we should do is declare who will make attacks in this initiative step. All models that take part are known as combatants. Starting with the active player, both players with models in the combat will make attacks in the current initiative step. As this is initiative step 4 and I am the active player, I let my opponent know that my 7 Despoilers armed with chainswords will make attacks in this initiative step. My opponent then tells me that all 10 of his Tactical Marines will make attacks this step as well. All the declared models are now combatants. Step 2. Make pile-in moves. In the scrum of the melee, our warriors will now barrel forward to try and get to grips with the enemy. This step allows you to make a short move with your model to maximise the amount of attacks you'll make in the initiative step. This is called a pile-in move. If you have a combatant that is already in base-to-base contact with an enemy model, then these models are already engaged and do not need to make a pile-in move. All models in this initiative step who are not in base-to-base contact with an enemy model must make a pile-in move in order to get as close to the enemy as they physically can. Note that a pile-in move must happen. You cannot choose not to pile in. Starting with the active player, they should move each friendly model in this initiative step a number of inches equal to their initiative characteristic. The aim is to move the model into base-to-base contact with an eligible target model from the enemy unit. If they can get into base-to-base contact with an enemy model after this move, then they have successfully piled in. If they cannot, then they should end their move as close as possible to an eligible enemy model. Eligible enemy models are enemy models involved in the same combat. My opponent and I already have several models in base-to-base contact with one another, so these models would not make a pile-in move. All the other Initiative 4 models would make a pile-in move in order to get into base-to-base contact with the enemy. All the models have an initiative of 4, so we'll make a 4-inch move toward the enemy. As I am the active player, I move all my models first. I move each model 4 inches towards the nearest enemy model. After moving my Initiative Step 4 models, my opponent would now do the same for his Tactical Squad. His Tactical Marines also have an initiative of 4, so move 4 inches towards my models. A pile-in move ignores penalties from difficult terrain, however would still need to take dangerous terrain tests as normal. Note that only the active models in an initiative step would pile in at this stage. Models in later initiative steps would pile in during their initiative step. Now our models have made pile-ins, we now need to declare who is engaged in the combat. Only engaged models may make attacks. To be considered engaged with an enemy model, your model must fulfill one of the following criteria. Your model is in base-to-base contact with an enemy model, or your model is no more than 2 inches away from a friendly model from the same unit who is in base-to-base contact with an enemy model. If a model fulfills either of these, then they can make attacks. This is why it is important to get as close to the enemy as possible using your pile-in move. It is entirely acceptable to put your own models in base-to-base contact with each other to maximise your number of engaged models. Any models that do not fulfill the previous criteria will not make attacks in this initiative step. I can see that 5 of my despoilers and 5 of the enemy tacticals are in base-to-base contact. All these models are engaged. 2 of my despoilers are not in base-to-base contact, but are within 2 inches of other despoilers who are. They are also engaged. My opponent has 4 tacticals that are within 2 inches of friendly models in base-to-base contact, so they are also engaged. One of the tacticals is neither in base-to-base contact of an enemy or within 2 inches of a friendly model who is in base-to-base contact with an enemy. This model is not engaged and so will not make attacks. I have 7 engaged models in this initiative step. My opponent has 9. All these models will make attacks as part of this initiative step. Now we know who is fighting who, we now set strike groups. Strike groups are very similar to fire groups in the shooting phase. They are all the attacks a unit makes that have the same weapon name and are made with the same weapon skill. All dice for these strike groups will be rolled at the same time in a batch. If your unit contains attacks made by different weapons or made with different weapon skills, then these would form separate strike groups. If you have a model with a different weapon skill, but the same weapon as the rest of the unit, then this would also form a new strike group and would be handled separately. Some weapons may also feature multiple weapon profiles for the same weapon. If the same weapon in the unit is being used with different profiles, then these would also form new strike groups. And finally, if you are splitting attacks between units, then these must be sorted into separate strike groups as well. For our example combat, we have my 7 despoilers armed with chainswords. No other friendly models in this initiative step has a different weapon or a different weapon skill, so this would form one strike group, all my chainswords. My opponent would do similarly for his tactical squad. All have basic close combat weapons. This will form a strike group of 1 consisting of all attacks made with that weapon. Let's change things up a bit. Let's replace my opponent's tactical sergeant's basic close combat weapon with a power sword. This does not change the model's initiative characteristic as it has no initiative modifier, so he would remain in initiative step 4. However, the power sword has a different weapon name, so this would form another strike group. My opponent's 2 strike groups would be all the attacks made with the basic close combat weapons, and a strike group with all the attacks made with the power sword. Note that although they have different names, both will still happen at the same time, as they are both part of the same initiative step. I have a unit of 10 Terminators. 5 of them are armed with power fists, and 5 are armed with chain fists. The Sergeant is armed with a Power Fist as well, but he is also a champion, having a weapon skill of 5 compared to the other Terminator's weapon skill of 4. This squad would form 3 strike groups. Group A is the Power Fist attacks made at weapon skill 5. Group B is the Power Fist attacks made at weapon skill 4. Group C is all the Chain Fist attacks. The active player should decide which order the strike groups will happen, with them completing their strike groups first, followed by their opponent. Note that although they are happening separately, all attacks in the initiative step happen at the same time. You should see a strike group through to completion before moving on to another. Once we have all your strike groups sorted, we can now actually make our attacks. Step 5. Make hit tests. The process will now form a very similar cadence to the shooting attack process. Beginning with the active player, select one of your strike groups. For that strike group, tally up all the attacks that will be made in that strike group. To do that, look at the attack characteristic of the models involved, represented by A. The number is how many attacks the model has and how many dice they will roll when attacking. Multiply this number by the number of models in the strike group. This will give you the total number of attacks and the total number of dice you will roll. Looking at my Despoiler's profile, I can see that each has an attack characteristic of 2, which means they have 2 attacks each. There are 7 engaged models in this strike group. 2 times 7 equals 14. For this strike group, I will roll 14 dice. To tell me the number I need to roll, I refer to the weapon skill table on page 195 of the core rulebook. I would compare my model's weapon skill to my opponent's unit's weapon skill to tell me what I need to score. We both have a weapon skill of 4, so I can see that I need to roll 4+ on each dice to score a hit. Any rolls of 4, 5 or 6 are hits, and I can now try convert these into wounds. Any rolls of 1, 2 or 3 are misses, and should be discarded. But what if your opponent's unit contains different weapon skills? What do you need to roll then? In this situation, you would use the weapon skill that the majority of the enemy models in that unit have as the opponent's weapon skill. So if one model has weapon skill 5 and 4 models have weapon skill 4, then you would use weapon skill 4 as that unit's weapon skill. If the amount of models with different weapon skills is equal, then use the higher of the 2 weapon skills. If my opponent has 5 models with weapon skill 3 and 5 models with weapon skill 4, then I would use weapon skill 4 as that unit's weapon skill. Importantly, the bulky rule has no effect on this. It is the literal number of models you use to calculate your weapons unit's weapon skill. In our example scenario, all models involved have a weapon skill of 4, so I will need 4 pluses. I score 10 hits. I discard my 4 misses. With my hit tests complete, my opponent would now make their hit tests for their initial strike group. As my opponent has more than one strike group for this initiative step, they would decide which they would like to see through to completion first. My opponent decides on the strike group containing the basic close combat weapons first. Like me, they tally up all the attacks that will be made in this strike group. Tactical Marines only have a single attack each, so this strike group will have 8 basic close combat weapon attacks. He rolls 8 dice. All models involved have a weapon skill of 4. He refers to the weapon skill table on page 195 of the core rulebook to check what he will need to roll. My opponent will need 4 pluses just like me. They score 2 hits. My opponent discards their 6 misses. Note that sometimes rolling a specific score during your hit test will cause a special effect, such as critical hits 6. This means that if one of your dice scores a 6, then that dice is a critical hit. If this happens, then these become modified dice rolls. All the dice that are modified must be split into their own strike group separate from the main group. The player will finish resolving their current strike group through to completion, and once this is done, they must then resolve the modified strike group. 6. Make wound tests. Now we know how many hits have been successful, we now need to see if any of our attacks actually inflict damage on the enemy. We do this using wound tests. To do this, we compare the strength of our model, represented by the S on their profile, against the toughness of our enemy, represented by the T-stat on their profile. Whatever weapon your model is using may also have a strength modifier, represented by SM. We should add or subtract this modifier from our model's strength to calculate our dice roll. We use the table on page 197 of the core rulebook to see what score we need to roll. Roll all of the dice that scored a hit again and compare the score to the table. You are looking to match or exceed that score for each dice roll. A despoiler has a strength of 4. Chainswords have no additional strength modifier. This means our attacks will be strength 4. A tactical marine is toughness 4. If we look at the table, we see that we need 4 pluses, so any rolls of 4 or more will score a wound. Any rolls of 3 or less are fails and should be discarded. I re-roll my 10 hits, needing 4 pluses to wound. I score 5 wounds, including 1 6. I discard the 5 failed wounds. Sometimes rolling a specific score on a wound test will cause a special effect, such as Shred 6. This means if one of my wound dice scores a 6, then that dice will cause an additional point of damage. If this happens, then these become modified dice rolls. All the dice that are modified must be split into their own strike group separate from the main group. The player will finish resolving the current strike group through to completion, and once this is done, then they must resolve the modified strike group. As Chainswords have the Shred 6 special rule, and one of my dice has scored a 6, this becomes a modified dice roll. I should split this specific wound into its own strike group. I will return to it once I have completed this strike group. My opponent will now perform his wound tests for his strike group. A tactical marine has a strength of 4. Basic close combat weapons have no additional strength modifier. This means the tactical's attacks will be at strength 4 also. They will also need 4s to wound my despoilers. They successfully score 1 wound and discard the 1 failed wound. If you are attacking a unit that has different toughness values within it, for example a tech priest with a unit of Castellax, then you would use the toughness that the majority of the models within that unit have. If there are 2 values that have an equal amount of models in that unit, then use the higher value when attacking. Again, the bulky roll has no impact on the number of models, it is the literal physical amount of models that matters. Select target models. Now we know how many wounds have been caused by both sides, we now need to see who has suffered these wounds. You and your opponent should swap the strike groups that are currently active. You give all your successful wound dice to your opponent, and your opponent gives all their successful wound dice to you. These dice represent successful wounds that you will now apply to your models. The player who controls the unit being attacked decides who will suffer the wounds in their unit, although some special rules may override this. Normally, this will encompass the whole unit, so for example, you could say, I'm going to take these wounds on my despoiler marines. Note that the models selected do not need to be engaged or part of the current initiative step, and also do not need to be the closest models. It is entirely up to the player who the wounds will go against. If there is a model in the unit that has already suffered wounds, then this model should be the one that the next wound initially goes against. This does not apply to command or specialist models. If at any point an appropriate model cannot be selected, for example all enemy models are dead, then any remaining wounds are simply discarded. I will apply my opponent's single successful wound to my despoilers, while my opponent will apply my 4 successful wounds to their tactical marines. Make saving throws. Once both players have chosen the models that were wounded, they now have a chance to see if their armour or shielding stops the wounds and saves the target. First, we see if the model's saving throw can stop the attack. We compare their saving throw to the weapon's armour penetration. If the armour penetration is equal to or lower than the armour save number, then it goes clean through their armour and a saving throw is not possible. If the AP is a higher number than the saving throw number, then they can try to roll a saving throw. To attempt a saving throw, the player rolls 1 dice for every wound caused and tries to score equal to or higher than their model's saving throw. If they do, their armour stops the hit and saves the model. If not, then an unsaved wound is caused and that model immediately suffers damage. The player deducts the damage characteristic of the weapon from their model's wound characteristic. If the wound characteristic is reduced to 0, then the model is a casualty. The players do this for all the wounds caused until all have been saved or failed. As I have caused 4 wounds in this strike group, my opponent must pass 4 saves. Chainswords have an AP of 5, so my opponent will get their 3+ saving throw. They roll 4 saves and fail 1. This model will have 1 damage caused to them, taking them down to 0 wounds. This model is a casualty, however they should not be removed just yet. As my opponent has caused 1 wound in their strike group, I must pass a single save. Basic close combat weapons have no AP at all, so I will get my 3+ saving throw. I roll 1 dice and I also fail my save. One of my despoilers has 1 damage caused to them, taking them down to 0 wounds. This model is also a casualty, however again they should not be removed from play just yet. Some models have invulnerable saves, which are saves that kick in if their saving throw is bypassed by armour penetration. Other than this unique quirk, the process for rolling an invulnerable save is the same as a regular saving throw. Some models may also have a damage mitigation roll, such as Feel No Pain. This is a special save that kicks in if the model fails their normal saving throw or invulnerable save. The target needed for this specific type of roll will be covered in that model's special rules. With all saves rolled, this completes both players' chosen strike groups. Step 9. Select next strike group. Now you know how many casualties have been caused by your initial strike groups, you can move on to the next strike groups for both players in this initiative step. Again, the order these will be completed in is entirely up to the player who owns that strike group. They would repeat steps 5 to 9 for these subsequent strike groups, rolling to hit, rolling to wound, selecting targets and allowing their opponent to make saves. I have a single strike group remaining for this initiative step, containing my modified dice roll wound caused by the Shred special rule. My opponent also has a single strike group remaining for this initiative step, his Power Sword strike group. We see both of these through to completion. My opponent repeats steps 5 to 9 for the Power Sword, successfully hitting and killing another one of my despoilers. As my strike group is an already successful wound, we simply repeat step 9 for this strike group. My opponent again fails a save, and another tactical marine becomes a casualty. We do not remove any slain models just yet. Once both players are out of strike groups, then we would move on to the final stage of this initiative step. Again, although myself and my opponent have taken turns rolling dice and completed strike groups one after another, all the attacks in an initiative step happen at the same time in game terms. Although we have both suffered casualties, the casualties would still fight if they are part of that initiative step. Their attacks will happen before they are removed. This process continues until either all the strike groups for both units in this initiative step have been completed, or one of the units is completely marked as casualties. After that, then all the slain models from both sides are removed from play. If a model is removed as a casualty before its initiative step, then it will not get to make any attacks in this combat. You should be mindful about which models you are marking as casualties. If, at any point, all models from one side or other are removed as casualties completely from a combat, then this is considered a total victory for the remaining player. That unit is no longer locked in combat, and we move on to the next sub-phase. With a full initiative step completed, you would then move on to the next lowest initiative step and repeat the full process again for that initiative step. In our example combat, that would be initiative step 3. It will contain my 2 despoilers armed with power balls and no enemy models. They would follow all the previous steps of declaring combatants, making their pile-in move, declaring engaged models, setting their strike groups, in this case 4 power maul attacks, making hit tests, making wound tests, letting an opponent select target models, roll saving throws and damage mitigation, and finally removing casualties. This initiative step sees my opponent lose another 2 tactical marines. If any enemy models still survived after that initiative step, I would then perform my final initiative step, which is my sergeant armed with the power fist. He would also follow all the previous steps of declaring combatants, making a pile-in move, declaring engaged models, setting his strike group, in this case 2 power fist attacks, making his hit tests, making his wound tests, letting his opponent select the target models, letting them roll saving throws and damage mitigation, and finally removing casualties. This initiative step sees my opponent lose a single tactical marine. In total, I have killed 5 of my opponent's models. My opponent has killed 2 of my models. Be sure to keep a note of how many models were killed by both sides for the next subphase. If there are no other initiative steps remaining, then this combat round is completed. Any models that find themselves not in base-to-base contact with an enemy from the target unit would make one final pile-in move to try and get into base-to-base contact. Remember, a pile-in move is equal to the model's initiative characteristic in inches and directly toward the nearest enemy model from the target unit. Vehicles work differently in the fight subphase. The majority of vehicles do not have a weapon skill or an initiative characteristic, so cannot make attacks in the fight subphase. However, they can still be attacked by opponents. If you are in base to hull contact with a vehicle in the fight subphase, then you can make attacks on it using the same steps we have just described. You would still calculate your initiative steps. You would follow steps 1 to 4 of the initiative step process. However, when you reach step 5, make hit tests, this will change. All your attacks will hit a vehicle on a 2+. No need to check the weapon skill table. If a vehicle has no weapon skill characteristic, then you will always hit it on 2+. In step 6, you would not roll to wound a vehicle, but would instead perform an armour penetration test, just like you would for a shooting attack. This is always calculated using the vehicle's rear armour value. To do this, roll a d6 for each successful hit and add the result to your model's strength, plus any strength modifier of their weapon. This is your armour penetration roll. If the score is below the target vehicle's armour, then the attack bounces off, causing no damage. These dice should be discarded. If the total value equals the vehicle's armour value, then the hit glances the vehicle, causing a glancing hit. No damage will be done immediately. However, you will inflict a status on the vehicle. Roll a d3 and compare the result to the vehicle damage table. The vehicle immediately suffers that status effect. If you score multiple glancing hits, then you roll multiple times on the table. For every duplicate result on the vehicle table after the first, the vehicle will suffer 1 damage from its hull points. If the vehicle already had a status, and your glancing hit causes that status again, then it suffers 1 damage from its hull points. In this way, it's possible for weaker weapons to status down a vehicle with numerous duplicate results. If your armour penetration roll's total value exceeds the vehicle's armour value, then the attack penetrates the vehicle's armour, and your attack will now deal damage against the vehicle's hull points. If the vehicle's hull points ever reaches 0, then the vehicle is destroyed and removed as a casualty. Note that if even after adding a full dice roll of 6 to an attack strength it cannot equal the vehicle's armour value, then damaging it is impossible. There is nothing to stop you attacking it still, for example with a shock weapon, but some weapons simply have no chance of damaging vehicles. A marine with a chainsword is never going to bother a land raider. A further note is that vehicles can never be locked in combat, and if the vehicle survives your attacks, then it is free to move away in its next movement phase, and enemy units can shoot your unit in their shooting phase. Knights, on the other hand, differ from regular vehicles. They possess a weapon skill characteristic, an attack characteristic, and an initiative characteristic, meaning they can take part in combat like infantry models. They would be sorted into initiative steps as normal, and you would use the weapon skill table when calculating what dice rolls are needed to hit the knight and for the knight to hit back. Armour penetration tests against knights would still be performed against their rear armour. After you have completed all the initiative steps of one combat, then you would then move on to the next active combat and perform the same steps again. You would do this until all combats have fought a full round of combat. Then you would move on to the resolution subphase. The resolution subphase is the final part of the assault phase. It comes directly after the fight subphase and acts as a direct sequel to it. Units that take part in the fight subphase will always complete the resolution subphase afterward. If no units fought in the previous stages of the assault phase, then this subphase can be skipped over. To take part in this subphase, you must have an active combat on the table that has just completed a full combat round in the fight subphase. A combat round consists of all the models involved in both units making attacks on the other, and then both sides removing casualties as needed. Once all active combats on the table have completed a combat round, then you should move onto the resolution subphase. In this subphase, you will decide who has won each of the active combats on the table. Once a winner and a loser for each combat has been identified, then both units will have several options on what to do next. These options range from remaining in the combat to fight again in the next turn, to both fleeing from combat and pursuing enemies who do so. Before any other part of this subphase is completed, any models you have that were taking part in challenges should be returned to their parent unit. Please check out the challenge subphase video on how exactly to do this. The resolution subphase is broken up into 4 main steps: total combat resolution points, declare winner, make panic checks, and aftermath. Let's walk through each stage together. It is important that you have kept track of both the outcomes of any challenges during the challenge subphase and any model slain during the fight subphase of this turn. Step 1. Total combat resolution points. The first thing we need to do is see how many combat resolution points each unit scored during the previous subphases. A combat resolution point is a point your side scores for performing well in a combat. The side that has the most combat resolution points in a combat is the winner of that combat, while the side that has the least amount of combat resolution points is the loser. The combat resolution score of individual combats will have no impact on other combats on the table, and you do not carry combat resolution points between turns. You only total combat resolution points for the current assault phase. Each side involved in a combat will score a combat resolution point for the following conditions. A side scores a combat resolution point for every enemy model they were able to remove as a casualty during the fight subphase. The amount of wounds the model has does not matter, only physical models removed as casualties. If one side was able to remove 3 enemy models as casualties, this would be 3 combat resolution points. A side scores a combat resolution point if it has more models remaining in the combat after all casualties have been removed than the enemy unit. If your models outnumber the enemy's models, then you score a point. This can only be scored once per combat, and the number of models counted includes all friendly units involved in that combat. If I have 2 units of 10 models each remaining in the same combat, while the enemy only has 5 models, then I will score the point. You do not get multiple points for having multiple units involved in the same combat. If the amount of models is equal on both sides, then nobody scores a point. Some models, such as walkers, have a special rule that allows them to count as a certain amount of models when calculating this specific combat resolution point, or models may be equipped with an item such as a Legion standard that also counts as additional models. Be sure to include this when calculating who outnumbers who. If the combat included models that were involved in a challenge, then the outcome of this may grant additional combat resolution points. Most commonly, this will be the winner of the challenge scoring the slain opponent's wounds as combat resolution points. It is important to keep a tally of how many points were scored as part of the challenge. Your unit may have additional special rules or war gear that allows it to score additional combat resolution points. For example, a Legion Vexilla automatically adds +1 combat resolution points to your score, while the Wordbearer's Unwavering Conviction special rule means that models with the Wordbearer's trait score an additional combat resolution point. It is important to know the rules and equipment that benefit your side when calculating combat resolution. A round of combat has just been completed between Assault Squad A and Despoiler Squad B. Side A is led by a Master of Dissent, while Side B has a Vexilla. Side A was able to remove 3 enemy models as casualties this assault phase, while Side B was able to remove 2. Assault Squad A scores a combat resolution point for each enemy model they have successfully removed as a casualty. They score 3 points. Despoiler Squad B also scores a combat resolution point for each enemy model they have successfully removed as a casualty. They score 2 points. Assault Squad A has 9 models remaining in the combat. Despoiler Squad B has 12 models remaining in the combat. Despoiler Squad B scores an additional point for outnumbering the enemy side. Both sides now have 3 points. Despoiler Squad B also has a Vexilla, a special piece of war gear that adds +1 combat resolution points to their total. They now have 4 points. For this combat, Assault Squad A has scored 3 points. Despoiler Squad B has scored 4 points. Step 2. Declare winner. Now we have our total combat resolution points for each side involved in the combat, we can declare a winner and a loser. Whoever has scored the highest number of combat resolution points during the combat is the winner. Whoever has scored the least amount of points is the loser. In our previous example, Assault Squad A had scored 3 points and Despoiler Squad B had scored 4. For this combat, Despoiler Squad B would be the winner. Assault Squad A would be the loser. Once a winner is declared, then you would move on to step 3 of the resolution subphase. If both sides have an equal amount of combat resolution points, then this combat would be declared a draw. This combat would instead move on to step 4 of the resolution subphase. Step 3. Make panic tests. Once a winner has been determined, then the losing side may panic in the face of their resurgent enemy and flee from the combat. This is known as a panic test. The losing player will make a single leadership test for their entire side involved in a combat. To make a leadership test, they will roll 2d6 and compare the result to the leadership value of the majority of the friendly models involved in that combat. The player needs to score equal to or under their leadership value to pass the test. If they score over the value, then the test is failed. Note that a roll of a double 1 will always pass this leadership test, while a roll of a double 6 will always fail the leadership test. This single leadership test will be for all friendly units involved in a single combat. If I have 3 friendly units involved in the one combat, then I will still only need to pass one leadership test. Again, the number required will be the leadership value the majority of the friendly models involved in the combat have. If any of the models on the losing side have either the Sergeant or Command subtypes, then their leadership value can be used instead. Most importantly, the losing side will also suffer a modifier to this test. The difference between both sides' combat resolution scores will be applied to this test as a negative modifier. So, if there had been a 3-point difference between mine and my opponent's scores, then the leadership test would have a -3 modifier. The more convincingly a side wins a combat, the more difficult the following leadership test will be for the loser. Again, note that a double 1 will always pass this leadership test, while a roll of a double 6 will always fail the leadership test. If the losing side passes the leadership test, then they do not panic. They would then move on to step 4. If the losing side fails the leadership test, then all the friendly units involved panic. All friendly units on the losing side involved in the combat immediately gain the routed status. They would lose any other statuses they had prior to this point. They would then also move on to step 4. If a unit on the losing side already had the routed status, then they do not require a leadership test at all. They maintain their routed status and also move on to step 4. In our previous example, Assault Squad A had scored 3 points, while Despoiler Squad B had scored 4. Despoiler Squad B was declared the winner. Now, Assault Squad A would need to pass a leadership test. The majority of the models in Assault Squad A have leadership 7. However, the squad has a Sergeant model with leadership 8 and a Master of Descent who is a command model with leadership 9. The controlling player can choose either one of these models for the leadership test. They choose the Master of Signals. Assault Squad A have lost the combat by 1 point, as 4 take away 3 equals 1. They will apply this as a negative modifier to the leadership test. The Master of Descent's leadership is 9. 9 take away 1 equals 8. So when they roll the test, they will need to score 8 or under to pass. Assault Squad A rolls 2d6 and needs to score equal to or under the required score of 8 to pass. However, they roll a 9. The leadership test is failed. Assault Squad A and the attached Master of Signals immediately gain the routed status. Both units would now move on to step 4 of the resolution subphase. Step 4. Aftermath. Now we know who has won and lost the combat. Each unit involved will now select an Aftermath option. An aftermath option is what the unit will immediately do now the combat is completed. There are numerous different aftermath options, but a unit will only have access to a limited number depending on whether they won the combat, lost the combat, or both sides drew in the combat. Note that some factions will have special rules or equipment that give them access to unique aftermath options, such as the Custodes' Blade of Mercy. For ease, we will focus only on the core aftermath options presented in the core rulebook. The options available to you during the aftermath step will depend on whether you won, lost, or drew the combat. The losing player will always choose their aftermath options first. Each of the units involved in the combat can have different aftermath options selected for them. However, the losing player must make their aftermath options before the winning player. Then, the winning player will declare their unit's aftermath options. Note that if there were multiple combats on the table at the same time, then the roles of winner and loser can switch back and forth. If your unit has lost the combat and then failed the subsequent panic test, then they have one aftermath option: fall back. If your unit had the routed status prior to the combat being fought, then they must also fall back. If your unit lost the combat, but then passed their panic test, then they have 3 aftermath options. They can hold, disengage, or fall back. If your unit won the combat, and the enemy falls back, then you have 3 aftermath options: pursue, gun down, and consolidate. Let's look at how you complete each of these options individually. If a unit has the routed status, then they must fall back. This is almost identical to the fallback procedure described during the Rout Sub Phase of the movement phase. A fallback is an undisciplined flight from combat, your unit fleeing to try and save itself. You have very limited control over a unit that is falling back. All units that need to fall back must roll a d6 and add their initiative characteristic to the roll. The models in the unit will immediately move that number of inches towards the nearest point on the board edge of their own deployment zone. If models within the unit have different initiative characteristics, then the models will move different distances from each other. If multiple friendly units from the same combat are routed, then each unit will have their own individual roll of a d6. Your unit can move through enemy units involved in the same combat to facilitate this move, but must end their movement at least 2 inches away from other enemy units. Note that it is possible for both sides in a combat to rout away from one another. For example, if a unit loses combat against an already routed unit, in this situation, both sides would follow the same fallback process. Note that if you drew the combat, then you can also choose to fall back. For more details on the fallback process, you can check out the Rout Sub Phase video highlighted above. If your unit loses the combat but didn't fail the following panic test, then they can choose to hold. A hold option is where your unit aims to keep the enemy locked in the same combat, keeping both sides in place. If your unit chooses to hold, then all models in that unit immediately make a pile-in move. A pile-in move is a number of inches equal to your model's initiative characteristic straight towards the nearest enemy model involved in the same combat. This move's aim is to get into base-to-base contact with the enemy models. If a model is already in base-to-base contact, then it does not need to make a further pile-in move. A pile-in move must move its full distance towards the enemy, only stopping if it successfully gets into base-to-base contact with an enemy model, or it has moved its full distance. Pile-in moves ignore modifiers from difficult terrain, but still trigger dangerous terrain tests as normal. If, after this move, any of your models are in base-to-base contact with models from the enemy unit, then you have successfully piled in. Note that this does not count as a successful charge. If none of your models gets into base-to-base contact with the enemy, then neither unit is locked in combat. Note that if you drew the combat, then you could also choose to hold. If your side lost the combat, but you were able to pass the following leadership test, then your unit can choose to disengage. A disengage move is a short, controlled move designed to get your units away from the combat and ready to take part in the next turn. All models in the unit immediately move their model's full movement characteristic in any direction the player chooses, so long as it is directly away from enemy models from the same combat. The models must end this move in unit coherency, and they must end their move at least 2 inches away from enemy models from the same combat and 2 inches away from any other enemy models. You cannot end a disengage move in base-to-base contact with enemy models. Your unit can move through the enemy units involved in the same combat to facilitate this move. If any of your models would end its move less than 2 inches away from enemy models still locked in the same combat, then these models can extend the distance move by whatever is needed to hit the full 2-inch mark. A disengage move is affected by both difficult and dangerous terrain as normal. If the disengage move would take any of your models closer to an enemy model involved in the same combat after moving, then a disengage move is impossible. The unit would instead need to use the hold aftermath option instead. If your unit ends the turn with no enemies in base-to-base contact with it, then it is no longer engaged in combat and can act normally from that stage onward. If, for any reason after the disengage move, any of your models are out of coherency, or any of your models finds itself in base-to-base contact with an enemy model, then the unit is immediately routed. Note, only units that lost combat and pass a leadership test can choose to use the disengage option. Units that draw combat can never use it. If you win or draw a combat and your opponent's unit falls back, then your units can choose to pursue. Note that falling back is different from disengaging. When pursuing, your unit will attempt to chase down the enemy unit in a bid to lock them back up in combat. To make a pursue move, all units that choose to pursue must roll a d6 and add their initiative characteristic to the roll. Each unit will roll an individual d6. The models in the unit will immediately move that number of inches towards the nearest enemy model in the falling back unit. A unit can only pursue one other unit at a time. If the move ends with one of the pursuing models in base-to-base contact with a model from the falling back unit, then your unit has successfully pursued the enemy unit. Both units are once again locked back in combat and will fight a new combat round in the next assault phase. A successful pursuit also counts as a successful charge, so any rules that require a charge such as impact will be active in the next combat round. If the move does not reach the enemy unit, then no further effects occur. If you win or draw a combat and your opponent's unit falls back, then your units can choose to gun down. Note that falling back is different from disengaging. The gun down option sees your unit draw up a hasty firing line, opening fire on the fleeing enemy. However, due to its ad hoc nature, the firing is not particularly accurate. If your unit chooses to gun down an enemy that is falling back, then your unit immediately makes a shooting attack on the enemy unit. A unit can only gun down one other unit that is falling back. This shooting attack is completed like a volley attack, so normally will be completed using snapshots and using assault trait weapons only. Note that some special rules or equipment may override this. Otherwise, your unit remains in place. Finally, if your opponent either falls back or disengages from the combat, then your unit can choose to consolidate. A consolidate move is a move your models can make to try and gain a bit of ground or get in a more advantageous position for the next turn. The models in your unit can immediately make a move in inches up to their individual initiative characteristics. This move ignores the effects of difficult terrain, but will still require dangerous terrain tests as normal. This move can be in any direction, so long as it ends at least 2 inches away from enemy models. The consolidating unit must maintain unit coherency as well. Note that if both sides drew, then the active player can decide which side will pick their aftermath option first. Again, this side's units must all have options chosen and completed before the other side, and each unit involved in the drawn combat can have a different option chosen. In our previous example, Assault Squad A had scored 3 points, while Despoiler Squad B had scored 4. Despoiler Squad B was declared the winner, and Assault Squad A failed their leadership test and routed. Now, both units will choose an aftermath option. As the loser, Assault Squad A will choose and complete their aftermath option first. If a unit has the routed status, then the only option they can choose is to fall back. I roll a d6 for the routed unit and score a 5. I will add this to the individual model's initiative characteristic to calculate how far the unit will fall back. The Assault Marines have an initiative of 4, and the Master of Descent has an initiative of 5. The Assault Marines will move 9 inches during their fallback move, and the Master of Descent will move 10 inches. All models move directly toward the nearest board edge in their own deployment zone. If needed, they can move through enemy models in the same combat to make this move. Once this move has been completed, that is the loser's aftermath option completed. Now, the winning unit can choose their aftermath option. As they have won the combat and the enemy unit has fallen back, Despoiler Squad B has 3 options: Pursue, Gun Down, or Consolidate. Pursue will let the Despoilers attempt to catch the Assault Marines and lock them back up in combat. Gun Down will allow them to shoot at the fleeing unit with a round of volley fire. And Consolidate will allow them to make a small move in any direction to gain better ground. The Despoilers decide to pursue, keen to lock the enemy back up. To do this, Despoiler Squad B will roll a d6 and add that to their initiative score. They will then move this distance in inches towards the fleeing models. If able to get back into base-to-base contact, then they will lock the enemy back up in combat. However, Despoiler Squad only rolls a 1. Adding this to their initiative gives us a distance of 5 inches. All models move 5 inches towards the nearest enemy models from the fleeing unit. The Despoiler's move ends, failing to get into base-to-base contact, so neither unit is back in combat. And this would end the Resolution subphase for both units. Note that if during the fight subphase all models on one side are removed entirely as casualties, then this is classed as a massacre and a total victory for the surviving unit. This unit would immediately jump to the Aftermath stage. The one Aftermath option this unit would have is the Consolidate option, unless they have the Routed status, in which case they would fall back. Fundamentally, the Resolution subphase sees you complete the following key steps for all units that fought in combat this turn. 1. Return challengers to parent units. 2. Define winners and losers using combat resolution points. 3. Make panic tests for losing units. And 4. Make aftermath options for all units involved in the combats. This subphase is the capstone of the assault phase, and can see you successfully drive enemy units away by winning combats and challenges convincingly. By choosing fights carefully and giving your units the correct weapons and equipment, you can make the Resolution subphase incredibly easy for you and very difficult for your enemies. The end phase is the final part of a player's turn. It comes directly after the assault phase, and once completed would conclude the active player's turn. It has 3 distinct subphases: the effects subphase, the statuses subphase, and the victory subphase. The effects subphase is almost identical to its cousin in the start phase and has one function: the correct timing of special effects and special rules. If a special rule contains the phrase "at the end of the player turn" or words to that effect, then it will come into effect now in this subphase. If you have a special rule that activates at the end of the player turn, then now is when that effect would take place. If you require any dice rolls, measurements or characteristic checks to activate this special rule, then now is also when you would complete them. Similarly, if you have a special rule or effect that ends at the end of the player turn, then now is the point where that special rule would end. If this would also require any dice rolls, measurements or characteristic checks, then now is when you would complete them also. Finally, if the reactive player has any reaction points remaining, then they are discarded at this point and can no longer be used. Reaction points never carry over into other turns. If there are no rules or effects that activate or run out at the end of the turn, then this subphase can be skipped. Next is the statuses subphase. This subphase is where your units will try to remove tactical statuses inflicted upon them, either through characteristic checks or vehicle repair tests. The active player will perform checks on all units that have tactical statuses and attempt to remove them. They would perform checks for each status a unit has. The active player can select these units in any order they like. For the pinned, stunned and suppressed statuses, this would be a cool check. The unit would roll 2d6 and compare the result to the cool stat the majority of the models within the unit have. If they score equal to or under the stat, then the test is passed and the status is immediately removed. If the score is over the stat, then the unit remains statused. Units that contain a model with the command or sergeant subtype can use that model's cool stat instead. For the routed status, this would be a leadership check. The unit would roll 2d6 and compare the result to the leadership stat the majority of the models in the unit have. If they score equal to or under the stat, then the test is passed and the routed status is immediately removed. If the score is over the stat, then the unit remains routed. Units that contain a model with the command or sergeant subtype can use that model's leadership stat instead. Once I have performed all the required checks for one unit, then I would move on to the next applicable unit to perform checks on them. Note that these checks can also occur while locked in combat. I have two units with statuses. One has the suppressed and pinned statuses, while the other is routed and has just fallen back from combat in the same turn. In the statuses subphase, I can try and remove the statuses from the units. For Unit A, I would perform two cool checks, one for the suppressed status and one for the pinned status. The squad has a sergeant with a cool of 7. I will roll 2d6 for each check and try to score 7 or under. I roll a 5 for the suppressed status and a 6 for the pinned status. I can remove both statuses immediately, and my squad is fully effective again. For the routed status, I would instead perform a leadership check. The squad has a centurion who has a leadership of 9. I will roll 2d6 for the check and try to score 9 or under. Note that although I have literally just fallen back from combat, I will still get to attempt to remove my status. Oh dear, I have rolled an 11. The squad remains routed and would need to follow all the rules for routed units in the next turn. Vehicles will also attempt to remove statuses in this subphase as well, but as they do not have a cool or a leadership stat, they would instead perform a vehicle repair test. To perform this test, you would roll a single d6 aiming to roll a 6. Only one vehicle repair test can be attempted per vehicle. If a 6 is rolled, then the repair test is a pass, and the player can remove a single status of their choice from the vehicle. If it is failed, then the vehicle remains statused. As only one test can be performed per vehicle, you can only ever remove a single status from a vehicle per turn. This is why it is important to have other ways of mitigating statuses on vehicles. Once a vehicle has performed its vehicle repair test, then the player would select the next applicable vehicle to perform another vehicle repair test. This can be in any order of the player's choosing. I have two Predator tanks, and both have statuses. Predator A is pinned, while Predator B is both pinned and stunned. I can attempt to remove statuses from both tanks in the statuses subphase. I will roll a vehicle repair test for each of the tanks. For each vehicle, I will roll a single d6 and aim to score a 6. If I do, the vehicle repair test is passed and I can remove a status. I roll a 3 for Predator A. The test is failed and the tank remains pinned. I roll a 6 for Predator B. The test is passed. However, I can only remove a single status with this successful test. I remove the pin status to allow my tank the ability to move once more. It will, however, remain stunned. Although Predator B had two statuses, it only gets a single vehicle repair test. Some vehicles have the Auto Repair X special rule. This special rule makes the vehicle repair test more effective. Instead of attempting to score a 6 on 1d6, the vehicle would instead aim for the score highlighted by the X. A Land Raider carrier has the Auto Repair 5+ special rule. This means that instead of looking to score a 6 for a successful vehicle repair test, the player would instead require a 5+ on 1d6. This makes Land Raider carriers more effective at removing statuses than most other vehicles. They would still only get one attempt per turn, however. Note that a vehicle repair test is only for removing statuses. It cannot be used to regain hull points lost during the battle. Once all your applicable units have attempted to remove their statuses, then this subphase would be complete. The player would then move on to the victory subphase. This is an important thing to note as players can easily get this wrong. All your units will attempt to remove their statuses before moving on to the victory subphase. This means these units can potentially become scoring units once more. The final subphase of a player's turn is the victory subphase. This subphase is when a player would score victory points for certain missions. If the mission's special rules state that the active player can score victory points in the victory subphase, then now is when they would score those points. The player's score would go up by the appropriate amount scored. Only the active player scores points during this subphase. Note that how the player scores these victory points will be described in the mission's details. Once the active player has tallied their victory points, then their turn ends and their opponent becomes the active player. If this is the final turn of the game and you did not go first, then the game would end at this point. Although the start and end phases are quite brief, they are both incredibly important to the correct functioning of the game. It is important to understand when key rules happen, when statuses can be removed, and of course when victory points can be scored. And that is how to perform the player turn. Thank you very much for watching.